from Harlem to the hallowed halls of Harvard.
She was on her way up.
And he was a budding songwriter, penning hits for stars at the top of the charts.
He wrote for acts such as New Edition, as well as Ryan Leslie.
Together, they seemed like a match made in heaven.
She was absolutely in love.
Until jealousy and greed turned their picture-perfect world upside down.
It was a big love triangle.
You could see the blood on the ground from where he collapsed.
My head was just spinning.
The investigation would send police on a desperate manhunt and lead them to the unlikeliest of suspects.
Love makes people do crazy things.
This story involved drugs, murder, a robbery. Things like this just don't happen in an Ivy League institution.
May 18th, 2009. It's a beautiful spring day in Cambridge, Massachusetts. At prestigious Harvard University, students are preparing for final exams. But just before 5 p.m., the stillness is shattered in an explosion of violence when gunshots ring out from the Kirkland House dormitory.
No one could have seen this coming.
It was really shocking.
Seconds later, a young African-American man stumbles from the dorm and into the path of stunned onlookers. Suffering from what appears to be a gunshot wound to the abdomen, the man slumps to the ground, a pool of blood collecting underneath him. Moments later, the first 911 calls begin pouring in. Police and paramedics race to the scene and rush the man to the nearest hospital. Word of the shooting spreads like wildfire across campus, leaving everyone wondering, how could something like this have happened at such a revered institution?
My boss told me somebody got shot at Harvard, and I looked at him like, with what, a super soaker? Because people usually don't get shot at Harvard University.
But as police comb the campus for clues, they uncover a seedy undercurrent of sex, lies, and drugs, along with a conspiracy that will threaten to take down one of Harvard's brightest stars.
This young woman was just caught in a bad situation.
Born in Harlem, New York in 1987, Brittany Smith didn't come from a life of wealth and privilege.
She had an upbringing with a single-parent household. She lived with her father. Her mother was on narcotics, and so her father predominantly raised her.
But Brittany didn't let her tough upbringing keep her down. She dreamed of one day attending an Ivy League school and worked hard to achieve it.
Brittany Smith was a very bright child. She went to a high school that had a very rigorous curriculum. Graduated from there, top of her class.
Very scholarly, loved doing volunteer work. She organized canned food drives and was an officer for her student council.
All that hard work paid off in 2005 when Brittany was accepted into one of the most prestigious institutions in the world, Harvard University.
She started in Harlem and then ended up at Harvard. Brittany was clearly somebody who was very dedicated to her education and very dedicated to her future.
But due in large part to her modest background, life at Harvard wasn't always an easy fit for Brittany.
Brittany was in a completely different world from the world that she grew up in. At Harvard, most of the students come from an upper middle class to upper class financial background. She felt quite isolated.
Even so, the gifted student did make a handful of friends at Harvard. Among those was another New York native named Shaniqua Campbell.
Hey, how are you? Great, how are you? Good, how's your day? Good.
Brittany worked with Shaniqua at the Harvard Student Assistance Office, and the two became fast friends.
Shaniqua Campbell was from the Bed-Stuy neighborhood of Brooklyn, New York, and she attended a high school with an academic program that was just as rigorous as Brittany's in preparing students for the Ivy League.
But even with a friend like Shaniqua by her side, something still felt missing in Brittany's life. A man to share it with.
She's brilliant. She's got her whole life ahead of her. And she just has this one piece of her that's just not being fulfilled.
But one weekend, Brittany met someone who would change her life forever. Up-and-coming songwriter, Jabri Coffney.
I'm Jabri.
Hey, I'm Brittany.
It's nice to meet you, Brittany. I mean, Forgive me for staring, but you're the most beautiful girl I done seen all night.
Jabri was very, very handsome, very attractive.
Hailing from Harlem, Jabri wasn't just dashing, he was also ambitious.
He grew up in a similar circumstance in a neighborhood that didn't have as much promise as he had hoped. But he was able to rise above that. He ended up becoming a songwriter. He wrote for acts such as New Edition, as well as Ryan Leslie.
For Brittany, one look at Jabri and she was hooked.
Brittany Smith falls for Jabri.
The son of a retired New York City police officer, Jabri was exactly the man Brittany felt she needed. He had a warm smile, a smooth style, and was a hometown celebrity.
He was charismatic. He made her feel good. And at the end of the day, what girl doesn't want to feel good?
Jabri visited Brittany nearly every week at Harvard. By her senior year, they were inseparable.
Hey.
What's up, baby?
She decided that she wanted to let him move into her dorm room and, him be her everything.
Since Jabri wasn't a Harvard student, Brittany had to keep their living arrangement in the Lowell House dorm a secret. But all the sneaking around was well worth the effort.
And a place where it's very easy to feel invisible, she became very important to him.
Living with the love of her life and just 2 weeks away from a Harvard degree, Brittany Smith's life seemed perfect.
She had a great boyfriend. She had a great education. She was finishing her education, and she had so much promise. The world was her oyster.
But then, May 18th, 2009, a terrifying shooting sends shockwaves through Harvard's campus. That afternoon, Brittany's due to meet a friend to shop for graduation dresses.
Hey, Brittany, it's me. I'm standing outside of your dorm. Where are you? Give me a call back.
After several hours, Brittany's still a no-show. It's an unusual move, especially for someone like her.
Brittany's nowhere to be found. It wasn't like Brittany not to answer her phone.
Given the mysterious shooting that just took place on Harvard's campus, friends fear the worst. But who is the victim in this horrifying shooting? And is it possible these two seemingly unrelated events are bound together in blood?
Don't pull a gun out if you're not about to use it. Go.
In May 2009, Harvard senior Brittany Smith and boyfriend Jabri Copney had all the makings of a beautiful life together.
She had a great relationship with someone that she really loved and trusted. She was 2 weeks away from graduating from the most prestigious university in the world. Everything was in front of her.
But on May 18th, Brittany went missing, leaving friends worried about her well-being. At the same time, police swarm Harvard's campus following a shooting inside the Kirkland House dormitory.
Can you tell me what happened? What did you see?
We just came from class. We noticed a guy come out of the Kirkland dorm right there, holding his stomach, bleeding.
Speaking to witnesses on the scene, they learned students had seen men fleeing the area moments after the shooting.
Was there anybody with him? Was anybody following him, chasing him?
There were 3 black males.
3 black males, okay.
One of the witnesses said when they saw 3 people run away from the scene of the crime, one was wearing an orange jacket.
The guy who got shot, have you ever seen him anywhere else around campus?
I've seen him before, just like in passing with class and stuff. I think his name's Justin.
Justin.
Detectives ultimately identified the victim as 21-year-old Justin Cosby. They reach out to Justin's family and inform them of his injuries.
I was completely devastated. I was in a state of shock.
Barely hanging on, Justin has been rushed into surgery.
I asked the doctor, was he going to die? And the doctor told me he could not promise that he wouldn't. I couldn't believe I was hearing him say that.
Even after surgery, Justin's wounds may be too severe to overcome.
Justin had been shot in the stomach, but the bullet had traveled towards his heart. Each time the blood pressure rised, then it dropped again. And I kept looking at the monitor until the monitor flatlined. And at the point of flatline, I just lost it.
Sorry, man, we're gonna need you to step out.
What's going on? Look at that.
Sorry, we're gonna need you to leave.
After frantic attempts to save his life, at 4 a.m., doctors pronounced Justin Cosby dead.
I just could not believe my son had actually died. This is my baby.
But who was Justin Cosby, and what could have sparked his terrible death? That evening, detectives sit down with Justin's mother to try and pinpoint a motive.
How long was Justin going to Harvard?
He's not a student at Harvard.
He's not a student at Harvard?
Justin was a student at Salem State University.
Justin was studying business administration, and he was also looking to study computer science.
He was so full of ambition, hope, life.
But what exactly was Justin doing on Harvard's campus that day? Questioning students, it doesn't take long for police to find one possible answer.
Justin supplemented his income by selling small amounts of marijuana to Harvard students.
Was it possible drugs had played some role in Justin's death? It seems plausible, but no one can imagine any of his regular customers were behind his violent death.
Everyone liked Justin, and he seemed to be pretty cool with just about everybody.
Detectives decide to pull Justin's phone records. Combing through his call log, they make a stunning discovery.
The last contact that he had was with Brittany Smith.
But Justin's friends and family have never heard of Brittany Smith.
They tried to contact her several times, and she didn't return any of their phone calls.
Is it possible Brittany's recent disappearance and Justin's murder are somehow connected?
Brittany Smith was the last person that he spoke with, according to the phone records. This makes one wonder, where is she? Is she a victim? Is she a suspect? At this point, it becomes a question of her safety.
Fearing the worst, detectives race across campus to Brittany's dorm room to conduct a welfare check.
The police went possibly looking for a body because she was missing.
Britt?
The knocks to Brittany's door go unanswered.
Brittany?
With help from the dorm's RA, police gain entry.
Once they opened the dorm room, there was absolutely nothing out of place. Everything was perfect.
It's all right with me. Yeah, I don't see anything wrong.
They said, this can't be a place of interest for us.
They kept going back to her room to look for her, and she wasn't there.
With one person dead, Brittany officially missing, and 3 potential suspects on the run, this investigation is growing more sinister and mysterious by the minute. But as detectives race to connect the dots, they'll soon uncover a startling new piece of evidence, along with a twisted trail leading back to the gates of Harvard's most famous rival, Yale University. It's now been hours since neighboring student Justin Cosby was gunned down at Harvard University. It's a crime that's rocked the campus and surrounding community and sent police on a desperate search for 22-year-old Brittany Smith.
Her phone number was the last phone number in Justin's phone. So that's a part of the mystery. Why is it that she's not answering her phone? Why is it that she haven't come back to the dorm?
Unsure if Brittany is also a victim or could somehow be involved in the murder of Justin Cosby, investigators decide to pay a visit to their counterparts at the Harvard University Police Department. Speaking to officers, they learn every student that enters a dormitory has to scan their school ID.
The police checked the Kirkland House security records. They discovered that Brittany's card had been swiped several times around the time of the murder.
But as police already know, Brittany lived in Lowell House, on the other side of campus from the dorm where Justin Cosby was shot. Still, there's no denying that someone did use her card to gain entry to the building that day.
Her card had been used so many times, so that's a little bit suspicious.
Given the circumstances, police decide to execute a search warrant on the Lowell House dormitory where Brittany lives. This seemingly routine search turns up something very unusual.
Well, looky here.
Can I get a picture?
In one of the closets, they find an orange and black varsity Letterman's jacket that looks just like the jacket that was described by witnesses earlier who saw 3 men leaving the scene of the crime.
It's a startling discovery.
Got a bag we can take this in?
But detectives still don't know who the jacket belongs to. or if it's an exact match.
Take a closer look at that.
After sending the jacket to the lab for processing, police expand their search to adjoining dorm rooms on the hunch that possibly another student used Brittany's card to gain entrance to the Kirkland dorm. It isn't long before they make another stunning discovery inside the nearby room of student Catherine Wilson.
Hey, look over here. What you got? It's loaded.
Loaded? I can see inside here.
It's a loaded 9mm handgun, the same caliber as the bullets recovered from Justin Cosby's body. But when detectives ask Catherine about the gun, they get more questions than answers.
Catherine, why did we find a gun underneath your bed?
I have no idea what you're talking about. You found a gun under my bed?
It's not your gun.
I don't own a gun.
Catherine says she typically leaves her door unlocked, and that someone must have stashed it there while she was out.
Why's your door unlocked?
This is Harvard campus. It's a safe place.
To detectives, it seems like Catherine's telling the truth, so they press her about the other women on her floor, one in particular.
You think Brittany might be involved?
Brittany? No way. She would never be involved in something like this.
But if Brittany's blockmate can't fathom Brittany killing Justin, then who had? One possible clue lay at the bottom of the bag that contained the pistol.
The police did find 2 IDs.
Those IDs belong to students from Yale.
I don't know those guys.
You don't know those guys?
No.
But what do 2 Yale students have to do with a murder on Harvard's campus? There's only one way to find out. Police bring Josh Bowman and Adam Cobb in for questioning. Detectives start with Josh.
How would you explain the fact is that we found your ID in a bag with a gun at Harvard?
When police confronted about why they found his ID at Harvard, he revealed a new story.
And what a story it turns out to be. Like Justin Cosby, Josh also has an entrepreneurial streak.
He was a Yale student who was dealing drugs at Yale.
Pressing Josh further, he eventually admits he does have a connection to Harvard.
I sell pot a little bit just to some people over at Harvard. I have a couple friends.
Then Josh drops one name detectives instantly recognize: Shaniqua Campbell.
Shaniqua was also a Harvard student and a friend of Brittany Smith's.
According to Josh, Shaniqua's no angel.
She was the real drug dealer on Harvard's campus. She sold a little bit of everything: marijuana, ecstasy, cocaine.
She's got all of it, man. Coke, ecstasy, shroom, I mean, all of it, everything. From what I know, she runs Harvard.
Josh claims that in 2008, he drove to Cambridge to attend the annual Harvard-Yale football game. Once there, Shaniqua summoned him to her dorm room for an impromptu meeting. When he arrived at her dorm, he wasn't greeted by Shaniqua, but by Brittany Smith's longtime boyfriend, Jabri Copney.
What's up?
What's up?
Hey, glad you came. Come on in.
How you doing?
Good.
See ya.
Jabri used to smoke pot with Shaniqua every day in her room.
So I was hoping to get my stuff.
I got it. But
Awesome.
before that, Jabri here, he wants to run some things by you.
Jabri propositioned to buy 3 pounds of marijuana from him.
All right. Let's do it.
The next weekend, he and his friend Adam drove down to New York to seal the deal.
He traveled to Grand Central Station to meet with Jabri.
But when they arrived, Jabri claimed he'd left some of the money at his Harlem apartment.
The 3 then traveled back to Jabri's apartment to get the rest of the money. And Blaine Jiggets, or as he was introduced to the 2 of them, Bat Boy, was waiting for them. They robbed the 2 Yale students of their 3 pounds of marijuana and take their IDs as well.
Josh's story is a revelation. But is it possible Josh's statement is simply a ploy to steer investigators away from himself? When detectives question Josh's friend Adam, he tells the same story. With no evidence to hold them, police decide to release Josh and Adam later that day. Faced with another dead end, police are still struggling to answer 2 key questions. Where is Brittany Smith? And who killed Justin Cosby? With a list of suspects growing longer by the day, And ranging from street-level drug dealers to Ivy League preppies, police can't rule out any possibility.
The first thing that would come into play is this is a turf war. And if this is a turf war, we're gonna end up in a very bad situation.
Harvard senior Brittany Smith thought she'd met the man of her dreams when Jabrai Copney walked into her life. But their two lives took an unexpected turn when Brittany went missing following the shooting death of 21-year-old Justin Cosby.
Brittany is the last person to be contacted. And after the police tried to reach Brittany, she went AWOL. She could not be found.
Adding to the mystery is the fact police have recovered a suspicious jacket from Brittany's dorm room, a room she secretly shares with boyfriend Jabrai, and a loaded handgun was found in a nearby room. When coupled with the statement of a student drug dealer from Yale, detectives are beginning to wonder if there's more to the relationship between Brittany's boyfriend Jabrai and her best friend Shaniqua Campbell. Namely that Jabrai and Shaniqua might be partners in the campus drug trade and are behind the Cosby murder as well as Brittany's disappearance.
Shaniqua sold ecstasy and cocaine and all sorts of drugs and was well known as a drug dealer on campus.
Shaniqua is pretty sneaky. She is the cornerstone of this whole problem.
Police decide it's time to bring Shaniqua down to the station and press her for some answers.
Let's start by telling us where you were May 19th. Do you remember?
I was taking a filing exam.
Shaniqua Campbell was really irritated that the police were asking her questions in regards to Justin's murder.
According to Shaniqua, the only thing she knows about Justin is his reputation on campus.
He sold weed. Everybody knew that.
Well, word is, you may sling a little weed. Is that true?
Sometimes.
So did y'all like have the same supplier, have the same clients?
We don't discuss that.
At first, Shaniqua seems to be telling the truth. But it's what Shaniqua says about her connection to Jabrai Copney that rings false.
When police asked Shaniqua Campbell if she knew Jabrai, she said yes, but only through her friend Brittany Smith.
Shaniqua says she barely knew Jabrai, let alone ever smoked any dope with him. As for Brittany, Shaniqua claims she hasn't seen her friend in days. To police, it all sounds pretty fishy. But with no evidence linking Shaniqua to Justin's murder or Brittany's disappearance, detectives are forced to let her go. But not long after their conversation, one burning question is finally answered.
24 hours after the shooting, Brittany Smith shows up in her dorm room.
Brittany,
Yes?
can we talk to you for a few minutes?
Yeah, come in.
Brittany, where have you been? We've been looking for you.
She tells police that she was homesick and she decided to go home to see her friends and family.
She said, "Oh, guys, I didn't even know you were looking for me. What happened?"
While detectives are relieved that Brittany is alive and well, they're curious why Brittany's key card had been used at the Kirkland dorm around the time of the murder.
We got your key card account, so we know you were over there.
Yeah, I just went to go visit a friend.
She said the swipe card had been used at Kirkland House because she had gone there to visit a friend.
From there, Brittany says she returned to her room, packed a bag, and headed to Boston's South Station Terminal to catch a bus back home to Harlem. But when police ask Brittany about the whereabouts of her boyfriend, Jabrai Copney, Brittany denies knowing anyone by that name.
Tell me about Jabrai.
Who's Jabrai?
Your boyfriend, Jabrai?
I don't know anyone by that name.
What are you talking about? Jabrai who? I have absolutely no idea who this person is, which would throw up a red flag.
Police had asked Brittany who her boyfriend was, and she had told them it was a boy named Jordan Coombs who lived in South Carolina.
So you don't know Jabrai at all?
No.
Police can tell Brittany is hiding something. Is it the fact that her boyfriend and best friend were potentially involved in a murder?
Brittany really loved Jabrai and lied to police.
But until Brittany opens up to police, there's little they can do to move the investigation forward. So detectives turn to Brittany's friends, hoping to learn a little bit more about her and Jabrai's relationship. It seems Jabrai had been enjoying all the perks of an Ivy League education, courtesy of Brittany and her electronic ID card.
It was basically like a vacation. You know, he had meals there, he had a place to stay, he was using all the gym, the cafeteria, he had a dorm to stay in. He got to go to Harvard without having to pay any tuition.
But according to Brittany's friends, like so many other legitimate Harvard undergrads, Jabrai started his own small business while on campus. Though Jabrai's startup wasn't exactly legal.
Copney had in fact set up a little gang from which he planned robberies, he sold drugs, all right on the Harvard campus, in the dormitory.
Brittany's friends tell investigators the drug dealing wasn't the only reason they didn't think too highly of Jabrai.
Brittany and Jabrai led a tumultuous relationship.
There's no record of anybody talking positively about their relationship. In fact, people saw them fighting.
Jabrai was a very jealous individual.
And apparently, when it came to Brittany's past, friends claimed Jabrai could get downright nasty.
Copney told her to get rid of the stuffed animals and the framed pictures of a previous relationship that she was in. Brittany then decided to hide these underneath her blockmate Catherine's bed.
It's the same bed where police had just recovered a loaded gun and 2 IDs, which begs the question, did Brittany know about the handgun? And whose was it? Jabrai's, Shaniqua's, or hers? Hoping to use this new information to get a better handle on Brittany's alibi, investigators head to Boston's South Bus Station. Pulling surveillance footage from the day of the shooting, officers spot Brittany boarding a bus bound for New York that evening. But Brittany wasn't traveling alone.
When they pull the tapes, they're shocked to find that Brittany did not go home alone. They find that she had purchased 3 other tickets as well as her own.
Could Brittany's entourage be the same 3 men witnesses had seen fleeing the scene of Justin Cosby's fatal shooting? If so, where are they now? As police intensify their manhunt, a shocking confession will finally reveal a twisted secret and a motive for murder. From the outside looking in, Brittany Smith and Jabrai Copney's love affair looked like a fairy tale. But following the murder of 21-year-old Justin Cosby, police have discovered that Jabrai was dealing drugs on the Harvard campus, and the couple's relationship was far from ideal.
Jabrai was very bossy to Brittany. He had a temper, and he ordered her around.
But just how far will Brittany go to protect the man she loves? A surveillance video taken on the day of the Cosby shooting shows Brittany boarding a bus with 3 other men.
Brittany bought 4 bus tickets, and they all boarded the bus together, and they went off to New York City.
Police quickly ID one of the men in the video, Jabrai Copney.
At that point, the police realized that Brittany had been lying to them about everything.
Brittany has turned an already bad situation into a worse situation. Because she lied to the police, now she becomes a suspect and not necessarily just a person of interest.
With Brittany refusing to tell the truth, police know it'll be hard to pin this crime on Jabrai and his 2 associates. Fortunately, they received the lab results on the orange and black Letterman jacket found in Brittany's room.
The forensic evidence showed that there was gunpowder on that jacket.
When they test the residue, they find that it also matches the residue found on the body of Justin.
They found gunpowder in it from the same weapon that was under Catherine's bed. How coincidental.
The jacket, the loaded 9mm, the surveillance footage fleeing to New York City. The only things still missing are Jabrai and his crew. But then, on May 21st, much to the surprise of investigators, Jabrai Copney walks into the Cambridge Police Department and surrenders.
Jabrai actually turns himself in once he realizes that the police have a plethora of evidence against him.
Interviewing Jabrai, detectives soon learn the identities of the 2 other men in the surveillance video.
It was me, my man Fat Boy, and then it was Jason.
The men Jabrai is referring to are Jason Aquino and Blaine Fat Boy Jiggets.
Blaine Jiggets and Jason Aquino were actually childhood friends, and they grew up together.
Basically, they wanted me to do a job for him, help him rob some marijuana from this Justin cat.
The Justin cat Jabrai is talking about is Justin Cosby. But according to Jabrai, the trio's plan to rob Justin went horribly from the get-go.
Jabrai, Jason, and Blaine lured Justin into the basement of the Kirkland house. When they were in the basement, they demanded that Justin show them the weed. Justin showed them the weed. They tried to take it from him.
They began to scuffle because Justin wasn't gonna let go of the marijuana without getting paid. Somewhere during the scuffle, Justin was shot one time.
It's an incredible story, but Jabrai's adamant he didn't pull the trigger.
Out of nowhere, Fat Boy pulls a gun out, pops him.
Fat Boy had the gun.
Yeah.
Armed with this information, police arrest Jason Aquino and Blaine Jiggets in New York City and charge the trio with Justin's murder. On March 16, 2010, Brittany Smith is arrested and charged with accessory after the fact, illegal possession of a firearm, and willfully misleading a police officer. The arrest rocks the Harvard community.
When I found out that the killer was not a Harvard student, yet he was staying at Harvard, using all of Harvard's amenities, and he had staged this robbery and had set up my son, I was flabbergasted.
As is the university. 2 weeks before their graduation, Brittany, as well as her friend Shaniqua Campbell, are expelled for their alleged drug use and potential involvement in Justin's murder.
I couldn't imagine having a free ride at an Ivy League university and ruining, graduating, and going on with my life to do great things over a crime 2 weeks before I graduate.
But even after her arrest, it's clear Brittany's love for Jabrai trumps any doors a Harvard degree could have opened up for her.
They're writing each other, and she wanted to marry him at some point, which is shocking.
On April 6, 2011, nearly 2 years after the shooting, Jabrai Copney's murder trial begins in Woburn, Massachusetts. With Brittany refusing to turn on him, Jabrai enters the courtroom looking cool, collected, and confident he'll walk out a free man.
I just wanted to go over there and wring his freaking neck. But I knew that would not bring my son back.
In their opening statements, prosecutors assert that on May 18, 2009, Jabrai Copney, Blaine Jiggets, and Jason Aquino conspired to rob Justin Cosby.
Justin had come to Harvard to sell some marijuana to someone he thought was a student there. And it was a large quantity.
Jabrai contacted Justin to purchase marijuana. Justin was lured down into Kirkland House.
Justin was not a big drug dealer. Apparently, he thought he could make some quick money.
So, homeboy, you got that for me?
Yeah, I got that. You got that for me?
Yeah, you ain't gonna see it until I see what I need to see, partner.
All right. You wanna see us here? What's up? Where the money at?
They tried to take the marijuana from him, so he put up a fight.
Give me the mother bag. You pulling it out like you about to leave? You ain't about to do nothing with it. You're not about to take this bag from me.
And at that point, Jabrai Copney shot him.
Don't pull a gun out if you're not about to use it. You're not about to use it, don't pull it out. You ain't gonna do nothing. Oh, it's counting.
Go. After the shooting, the three men immediately went back to Brittany's room, and Jabrai Copney told Brittany to hide the gun.
Prosecutors say Brittany, fueled by her love for Jabrai, did exactly as she was told. She hid the gun in the dorm room next to hers and fled on a bus with the three men back to New York.
Brittany was totally in this up to her neck. She provided the venue, the place where she allowed her boyfriend to come with his friends and load a gun in her room.
But without corroborating testimony, the state's case is largely circumstantial. Prosecutors give Brittany one last chance to come clean.
The prosecutor said, "You'd do anything to help Jabrai join Copney, wouldn't you?" And Brittany replied, "I've already tried everything and it failed. And now we're here."
That's what people do when they're in love. You do things for people that you're in love with that you wouldn't typically do.
Fortunately for prosecutors, Brittany's friend Shaniqua isn't quite so love-struck.
The deal that Shaniqua took was that she wouldn't be prosecuted if she gave the police truthful information about the crime.
Taking the stand, Shaniqua admits she regularly sold drugs at Harvard and was well aware of her competition, Justin Cosby.
Shaniqua was the one that apparently suggested to Jabrai to set up Justin, as she thought he would be an easy target.
Shaniqua says Jabrai agreed. It's an explosive revelation, but it pales in comparison to what Shaniqua reveals next.
Was your relationship strictly business, selling weed as it were?
In the beginning it was, but after a while, I mean, we were smoking weed, but anytime we smoked weed, it led to other things.
It came out that Shaniqua had actually been sleeping with Jabrai.
That was probably really hard for Brittany to swallow, that her best friend was sleeping with her boyfriend.
The love relationship between Brittany and Jabrai was one-sided. Brittany loved Jabrai. She would do whatever she could to help him. Jabrai's love to Brittany, or what she experienced the love, was really just something for his own benefit.
But in Cross, Jabrai's defense attorneys argue Shaniqua can't be trusted as a witness. Not only had she been quick to cooperate with police to avoid prosecution, she also had a long history of unscrupulous behavior.
Shaniqua was feeling some sort of infringement on her business because of Justin. And there was some manipulation on her part to actually get Justin out of the business a bit.
As for the actual shooting, Jabrai's attorneys argue that Blaine Fatboy Jiggets was the real trigger man.
The defense was that the actual shooter was Blaine Jiggets.
With everyone in the case pointing their fingers at each other, some observers wonder if the defense may have sown the seeds of reasonable doubt. But prosecutors still have one more witness left to call, and what she says will send shockwaves through the courtroom. Inside a Woburn, Massachusetts courtroom, prosecutors have asserted Jabrai Copney murdered Justin Cosby in a robbery gone awry, and then used his girlfriend, Harvard senior Brittany Smith, as a pawn to conceal his crime and hide the evidence.
Things like this just don't happen at an Ivy League school.
While Jabrai's defense attorneys don't dispute his involvement in the crime, they argue Jabrai's pal, Blaine Fatboy Jiggets, is the real trigger man. With so many fingers pointing in so many directions, a not guilty verdict seems like a done deal. That is until prosecutors call a state forensic expert to the stand. She tells the jury that a DNA swab of the murder weapon had indeed come back positive.
We were actually able to obtain a full DNA profile.
And who was that profile of, please?
It matched the defendant.
They did find that Copney's DNA was on the gun.
It's a damning piece of evidence, erasing any and all doubt as to just who murdered Justin Cosby.
Jabrai, he's the person that actually pulled the trigger. DNA doesn't lie. And his DNA was found on the weapon.
On April 22, 2011, jurors retired to deliberate Jabrai Copney's fate. Hours later, they returned with their verdict. Guilty.
He's sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole.
When he shot my son in the belly, it should have been a double murder rap, because that shot went straight to my heart, and it killed me also. I hope he never sees the light of day again.
6 months later, Brittany Smith pleads guilty to being an accessory after the fact, illegal possession of a firearm, willfully misleading a grand jury, and willfully misleading a police officer. She is sentenced to 3 years in prison.
Brittany really got a slap on the wrist. She was really the nucleus of this whole catastrophe.
If Brittany had owned up to her part in the beginning and told the truth, that she probably would not be in jail right now.
For his role in the murder, Blaine Jiggets receives a sentence of 9 to 12 years in prison. Jason Aquino receives 18 to 20 years. Despite her alleged involvement in Justin's murder, Shaniqua herself manages to avoid prison time.
Shaniqua really orchestrated all this thing. She's the one that was sleeping with Jabrai, yet she's the one that turned, and the prosecution said, "We want your testimony. You get no time."
While it's a verdict Justin's family still struggles with, they're not the only ones who lost out in this tragedy. For Brittany Smith, a young woman with so much promise, her blind love for a bad man ultimately cost her a life many aspire to, yet few can attain. The prestigious life of a bona fide Harvard graduate.
Brittany had her whole life in front of her, and Jabri did nothing but weigh that down. She could have dated anyone she wanted to, but she chose Jabri, and no one knows why, and that's something that she will regret for the rest of her life.
The house on that quiet suburban street looked like every other home that night. Still, dimly lit, wrapped in the kind of silence that only exists after midnight, when the world seems to hold its breath. Inside, nothing appeared disturbed at first glance. The furniture sat in its proper place, the walls carried the soft shadows of familiar objects, and the air felt heavy with the residue of ordinary life. But beneath that fragile illusion of normalcy, something had already gone terribly wrong. It wasn't the kind of wrong that announces itself with chaos. It was quieter than that, colder, calculated, and it had begun long before the first gunshot ever shattered the dark. When the emergency call came in, the voice on the other end trembled just enough to sound convincing. A young woman, breathless, terrified, claiming that men had broken into her home. Her words stumbled over each other, tangled in panic, but there was something about the rhythm, something just slightly off, like a rehearsed line delivered under pressure. She said her parents had been taken downstairs. She said she was tied up. She said she didn't know what was happening. But even in those early moments, before the police arrived, before the paramedics forced open the fragile boundary between life and death inside that house, the truth was already there, hiding in plain sight. Because this wasn't a random break-in. It wasn't a crime of opportunity or desperation. This was something far more unsettling. This was a story that had been building quietly, invisibly, for years. And the person telling it, the one who sounded so helpless on that call, was not just a witness. She was the architect. To understand what happened inside that house, you have to step backward into a life that, on the surface, looked almost too perfect. A life shaped by expectation, discipline, and the quiet pressure to succeed. A life where failure wasn't just disappointing, it was unthinkable. From the outside, she was everything a parent could hope for: polite, studious, accomplished. The kind of daughter neighbors would point to as an example. But perfection, when it's forced, has a way of cracking. And sometimes, those cracks don't show until it's far too late. The truth is, nothing about that night was spontaneous. Every detail had been carefully arranged, every movement anticipated. The unlocked door, the timing, the positioning of bodies. Even the fear in her voice had been practiced, shaped into something believable. Because fear, when it's real, is messy. It doesn't follow a script. But this fear did. And that was the first sign that something wasn't right. When officers arrived at the scene, they were met with a tableau that seemed, at first, to confirm the story. A young woman bound, shaken, claiming to have survived a home invasion. It was a narrative they had seen before. But as they moved through the house, as they followed the trail downward into the basement, the atmosphere shifted. The air grew heavier, the silence thicker. And then they found them. 2 bodies. Parents. Shot at close range. The violence was precise, deliberate, and deeply personal. This wasn't the chaotic aftermath of a robbery gone wrong. It was something else entirely. Something that felt intentional. Upstairs, the survivor waited. She cried. She answered questions. She played her role. But there were small inconsistencies, tiny fractures in her story that didn't quite align. The kind of details most people would miss. But investigators are trained to notice what doesn't fit. And what they began to see was a pattern, not of intrusion, but of staging. There were no signs of forced entry, no evidence of a struggle that would match her account. The bindings on her wrists told a story, but not the one she was telling. And then there was her demeanor. Shock leaves a mark. It lingers in the eyes, in the voice, in the way a person holds themselves. But her reactions felt measured, as if she were performing grief rather than experiencing it. And that's when the case began to unravel. Slowly, methodically, like pulling at a thread that reveals a much larger tear beneath the surface. What seemed like a tragic home invasion began to transform into something far more disturbing. Because the deeper investigators looked, the more they realized that this wasn't just a crime scene, it was a stage. And the person at the center of it wasn't just a victim. She was the one who had written the script. But even that revelation didn't answer the most important question.
Why?
What could drive someone to orchestrate something like this? To plan in such detail the destruction of their own family? The answer doesn't lie in a single moment. It doesn't come from one decision or one event. It's buried in years of pressure, of expectation, of secrets carefully hidden, and lies slowly compounded until they become impossible to escape. Because sometimes, the most dangerous stories aren't the ones filled with obvious darkness. They're the ones that look normal. The ones that unfold behind closed doors, in quiet neighborhoods, in homes where everything appears just fine. And by the time the truth finally surfaces, it's already too late. That night, as the investigation began to take shape, one thing became clear. This was not a random act of violence. It was something far more calculated, more intimate, and far more chilling. Because the real horror wasn't just what happened in that basement. It was the realization that the person who survived it, the one who called for help, who told the story, who seemed to be the only victim left standing, had been at the center of it all from the very beginning. And as the layers of deception began to peel away, what emerged was not just a crime, but a portrait of a life built on illusion. A life where the line between truth and fiction had been blurred for so long that, in the end, the only way out was through something unthinkable. Long before the sirens cut through the quiet of that November night, before the basement became a place forever marked by violence, there was a different version of the same house, one filled with routine, expectation, and a kind of order that, to outsiders, looked like stability. The neighborhood itself was the kind people move to when they want predictability. Tree-lined streets, identical mailboxes, driveways that filled with cars at the same hour each evening. In the mornings, garage doors would rise in near unison, releasing a steady rhythm of commuters heading toward the city. In the evenings, porch lights flickered on as if choreographed, signaling the end of another structured day. It was the kind of place where nothing was supposed to go wrong. Inside that house lived a family shaped by a very different kind of journey. Jennifer Pan's parents had built their lives from the ground up, carrying with them the weight of sacrifice that often defines immigrant stories. They worked hard, saved carefully, and believed, with unshakable conviction, that success was not just possible, it was required. Not for themselves anymore, but for their children. Every decision they made, every rule they enforced, came from that belief. To them, discipline wasn't cruelty. It was protection. It was a way of ensuring that their daughter would never have to struggle the way they once had. And so the structure of the household was built on that foundation. There were expectations, clear and non-negotiable. Education came first. Always. There was no room for deviation, no space for mediocrity. Jennifer's days were mapped out with precision: school, extracurricular activities, practice sessions, study time. Even her free time had boundaries. Piano lessons weren't optional. Figure skating wasn't just a hobby, it was another arena in which she was expected to excel. The rules extended beyond academics. Social life was tightly controlled. Friends were monitored. Relationships, especially romantic ones, were forbidden. It wasn't just about trust, it was about focus. Distractions were seen as threats to the future they had so carefully envisioned for her. From the outside, it worked. Jennifer performed well in school. She appeared disciplined, polite, respectful. Teachers saw a student who followed instructions, who met expectations, who didn't cause problems. Neighbors saw a quiet girl from a hardworking family. There were no signs of rebellion, no visible cracks in the image. But inside, something else was taking shape. Pressure, when it has nowhere to go, doesn't disappear. It settles. It builds. And eventually, it begins to distort everything around it. For Jennifer, that pressure became something deeply internalized. Failure wasn't just a possibility. It was a fear that grew larger with every passing year. And when the expectations began to exceed what she could realistically achieve, she didn't push back. She didn't rebel in obvious ways. Instead, she adapted. She learned to hide. It started small. A grade that wasn't quite high enough, quietly adjusted before it reached her parents' eyes. A story about school that wasn't entirely true, but close enough to be believable. Each lie was a temporary solution, a way to maintain the illusion of success. And, at first, it worked. Her parents saw what they expected to see. The image remained intact. But lies have a way of multiplying. One requires another, and then another, until the truth becomes something distant, almost irrelevant. By the time Jennifer reached the age where university decisions became the central focus of her life, the gap between reality and illusion had grown too wide to bridge. She hadn't been accepted into the programs her parents believed she had. In fact, she hadn't followed the path they thought she was on at all. But instead of confronting that reality, she made a choice, a quiet, desperate decision that would shape everything that followed. She pretended. Every morning, she left the house as if she were attending classes. She carried books, wore the right clothes, followed the routine of a university student. But instead of lectures and exams, her days were spent elsewhere. Sometimes at libraries, sometimes with friends, sometimes simply passing time, waiting for the hours to move so she could return home with a story that fit the narrative she had created. It was a performance, sustained day after day, year after year. And the longer it continued, the more convincing it became. To her parents, she was progressing exactly as they had hoped. To the outside world, nothing had changed. But internally, the strain was growing unbearable. Living a double life requires constant vigilance. Every detail has to be managed. Every question has to be anticipated. There's no room for error, no moment where the mask can slip. And over time, that kind of existence begins to erode something fundamental. The line between who you are and who you pretend to be starts to blur. Around this time, another element entered her life, one that would complicate everything further. A relationship, formed in secret, with someone her parents would never approve of. It wasn't just about love or connection. It was about escape. With him, she could be someone else. Someone not defined by expectations or pressure. Someone who didn't have to pretend to be perfect. But secrecy layered on top of deception only deepened the complexity of her situation. Now there were more lies to maintain, more risks to manage. And eventually, as it always does, the truth began to surface. It didn't happen all at once. It came in fragments, small inconsistencies, questions that didn't quite add up, details that couldn't be explained away. And when her parents finally began to see through the illusion, their response was immediate and severe. The structure of the household tightened. Restrictions increased. Freedom, already limited, was reduced even further. They took control of her communications, monitored her movements, and attempted to reassert the authority they felt had been undermined. To them, this was a correction, a necessary step to bring things back on track. But to Jennifer, it felt like something else entirely. It felt like being trapped. The life she had constructed, fragile as it was, began to collapse. The identity she had maintained for so long was no longer sustainable. And with that collapse came a realization, one that would set the stage for everything that followed. Because when you've built your entire existence on a foundation of lies, the moment it starts to crumble doesn't just threaten your future. It threatens everything. Your identity, your relationships, your sense of self. And in that moment, people make choices. Some confront the truth. Some try to rebuild. And some look for a way to escape, no matter the cost. Inside that quiet house, in that seemingly perfect neighborhood, the tension was no longer hidden. It lingered in the air, in the silence between conversations, in the unspoken understanding that something had changed. The structure that once provided stability had become something else, something rigid, suffocating, impossible to navigate without breaking. And somewhere within that pressure, within that narrowing space between expectation and reality, an idea began to form. Not all at once, not clearly, but slowly, taking shape in the background, growing more defined with each passing day. An idea that would transform frustration into intention, fear into planning, and eventually thought into action. Because the story of what happened that night doesn't begin with violence. It begins here, in the quiet buildup of pressure, in the small decisions that seem insignificant at the time, in the lies that feel harmless until they aren't. It begins in a house that looked perfect from the outside, where everything appeared to be exactly as it should be. And it grows unnoticed, until the moment it finally breaks through the surface, changing everything in an instant, and leaving behind a question that would haunt everyone who tried to understand it. How did it get this far? Before the violence, before the lies began to unravel under the weight of their own complexity, there was a woman whose life had been built on quiet routines and unwavering devotion. Her name was Bitch Ha Pan, though to those who knew her in the neighborhood, she was simply a kind presence behind a soft smile, a figure who moved through her days with a sense of purpose that rarely called attention to itself. She wasn't loud. She wasn't imposing. But she was constant. And in many ways, she was the emotional center of the home, the one who softened the edges of a life governed by structure and expectation. Her story, like so many others, began far from the suburban streets where it would eventually end. She had come to Canada with little more than determination, carrying the weight of a life that demanded resilience. The journey of immigration is often told in broad strokes: opportunity, sacrifice, success, but the reality is lived in smaller, quieter moments. Long hours at work, careful budgeting, the silent calculation of every decision, always with the future in mind. For Bitch Ha, that future was her family. Everything she did was for them. She wasn't driven by ambition in the conventional sense. She didn't chase recognition or status. Her goals were simpler, but no less profound. Stability, security, a better life for her children than the one she had known. And so she built that life piece by piece, day by day, with a patience that often goes unnoticed until it's gone. Inside the home, her presence was felt in the details. The meals prepared with care, the routines maintained without fail, the quiet ways she supported her daughter, even when the expectations felt overwhelming. If the father represented discipline and structure, Bitch Ha was the counterbalance, a source of warmth in a household that sometimes leaned too heavily on pressure. She understood, perhaps more than anyone else, the delicate line between pushing a child to succeed and allowing them space to breathe. But understanding doesn't always translate into change, especially in a family dynamic shaped by deeply rooted beliefs about success and responsibility. She lived within that structure too, navigating it in her own way, finding moments of connection where she could. To Jennifer, her mother was both a comfort and a complication. There were moments of closeness, of shared understanding that didn't require words. But there were also moments where the expectations, though often communicated through the father, felt reinforced by her silence. It wasn't that she agreed with every rule, every restriction. It was that she believed in the outcome they were meant to achieve. And in that belief, she became part of the system that was slowly tightening around her daughter. It's easy, in hindsight, to look for clear divisions, to assign roles, to simplify the dynamics into something easier to understand. But real families don't work that way. They exist in shades of gray, in overlapping influences and unspoken compromises. Bitch Ha wasn't an antagonist in her daughter's story. She was a mother trying to do what she believed was right, within the framework of a life that had taught her the value of discipline and sacrifice. And in that effort, she became both a source of support and, unintentionally, a contributor to the pressure that was building beneath the surface. Her days followed a rhythm that rarely changed. Mornings began early, often before the rest of the house had fully woken. There was comfort in that routine, in the predictability of tasks that needed to be done. It was a life defined not by grand moments, but by consistency. And there's a quiet dignity in that kind of existence, even if it doesn't draw attention. But beneath that calm exterior, there were signs Small, subtle indications that something wasn't quite right. Jennifer's behavior, though outwardly compliant, carried inconsistencies that were difficult to ignore completely. There were gaps in her stories, moments where the details didn't align. As a mother, Bitch Ha noticed these things. Not always consciously, not always with clarity, but enough to create a sense of unease that lingered in the background. And yet, confronting those inconsistencies directly wasn't simple. It meant challenging the narrative that had been carefully constructed, not just by Jennifer, but by the family as a whole. It meant risking the stability they had worked so hard to maintain. So instead, like many parents in similar situations, she navigated around it. Asking questions, offering guidance, trying to steer things back on course without fully dismantling what had already been built. It was a delicate balance, one that required trust. And trust, once strained, becomes something fragile. There were moments, quiet, easily overlooked moments, where the distance between mother and daughter became more apparent. Conversations that didn't go as deep as they once might have. Silences that lingered a little too long. These weren't dramatic shifts. They didn't announce themselves. But they were there, accumulating over time, creating a subtle separation that neither of them fully acknowledged. And still, through it all, Bitch Ha remained committed to her role. She cared. She supported. She believed in her daughter's potential, even when the path forward became less clear. That belief didn't waver, even as the foundation beneath it began to crack. Because for her, being a mother wasn't conditional. It wasn't dependent on perfection or success. It was constant, unwavering, rooted in a love that doesn't disappear even when things become difficult to understand. On the night everything changed, she was in her home, surrounded by the life she had helped build. There was no indication, in those final hours, of what was about to happen. No warning that the person she had raised, the daughter she had cared for and protected, was now part of something that would bring that life to an abrupt and irreversible end. The violence that followed wasn't just physical. It was a rupture, a breaking of something fundamental. Not just the loss of life, but the destruction of trust, of family, of the very idea of home as a place of safety. And in that moment, Bitch Ha Pan became more than a victim of a crime. She became a symbol of something deeper, something more difficult to process. The reality that sometimes the greatest threats don't come from the outside world. They come from within the spaces we believe are the safest. But reducing her to that moment alone would be an injustice. Because her life was more than the way it ended. It was defined by years of effort, of care, of quiet strength that often goes unrecognized. She was a mother, a partner, a person who carried the weight of her family's future and did everything she could to support it. And in telling this story, it's important to remember that. To see her not just as part of a tragedy, but as an individual whose life had meaning long before it became part of something so devastating. Because at the heart of every case like this, beyond the investigation, beyond the headlines, there are real people. Lives that were lived fully, even if they ended too soon. And understanding that is essential, not just for telling the story, but for honoring it in a way that goes beyond the details of the crime itself. The night of November 8, 2010, did not arrive with any sense of foreboding. It settled over the neighborhood the same way every other night did, quietly and without ceremony. The streetlights cast their familiar glow across empty sidewalks, and the houses stood in orderly rows, their windows dimming one by one as families retreated into sleep. Inside the Pan household, the rhythm of the evening followed its usual course. There was nothing outwardly remarkable about it, nothing that would suggest that this night would fracture everything that had come before. But beneath that calm surface, something had already been set in motion. Plans, once abstract and distant, had hardened into reality. Decisions that might have once felt impossible had been made, committed to, and now there was no turning back. Jennifer moved through the house with a familiarity that came from years of routine. Every corner, every creak in the floorboards, every shadow cast by the hallway lights, she knew them all. And that knowledge, once a source of comfort, had now become something else. It was part of the plan. Timing mattered. Precision mattered. The smallest detail could determine whether everything succeeded or collapsed. There was no room for improvisation. At some point that evening, the boundary between thought and action disappeared. The door that was supposed to remain locked was not. Whether it was opened deliberately or left unsecured, the result was the same. The barrier between the outside world and the safety of the home was gone. And with it, the illusion that what followed was an intrusion rather than an invitation. The men entered quietly. There was no dramatic crash, no immediate chaos. Just movement through darkness, controlled and purposeful. They had been here before in a different sense, not physically, but in the planning, in the conversations that had outlined exactly what needed to happen. They knew where to go. They knew who to find. Upstairs, Jennifer waited. This was the moment where everything she had set in motion would unfold, where the distance between her and the consequences of her decisions would collapse completely. There is a particular kind of silence that exists just before violence. It's not peaceful. It's tense, almost expectant, as if the air itself is aware that something is about to break. That silence filled the house in those moments, stretching thin until it could no longer hold. Then came the confrontation. Her parents were taken by surprise, pulled from the safety of their bedroom into a situation that made no sense. There was confusion first, then fear. The kind of fear that comes not just from the presence of danger, but from the sudden realization that the world you understand has shifted in an instant. They were forced downstairs, away from the familiar, into the basement, a space that would soon become the center of something irreversible. The movement was controlled, deliberate. There was no rush, no panic from the intruders. This was not a robbery spiraling out of control. It was structured, almost methodical. And that, more than anything, made it more terrifying. Upstairs, Jennifer's role began to take shape. She was restrained, her wrists bound in a way that would later be scrutinized for its authenticity. She positioned herself within the narrative that had been constructed, preparing to become the sole survivor of a crime that was meant to appear random. But even in that moment, there was a separation, a distance between the performance and the reality unfolding just a floor below. In the basement, the situation escalated. Words may have been exchanged, though what was said in those final moments remains fragmented, reconstructed only through partial accounts and inference. What is clear is that there was no escape, no opportunity to change the outcome. The violence, when it came, was sudden and final. Gunshots in a confined space carry a weight that lingers, echoing off walls, filling the air with a sharp, unmistakable finality. For Bitch Ha Pan, it was the end. Her life, defined by years of quiet resilience and care, was cut short in a moment that offered no warning, no chance to understand why. For her husband, the experience was different, though no less devastating. The shot struck, the pain immediate and overwhelming. But somehow, against all probability, he survived. Injured, disoriented, suspended between consciousness and oblivion, he remained alive in a space that had just become a scene of unimaginable loss. Upstairs, time moved differently. The seconds stretched, each one carrying the weight of what had just occurred. There is no clear record of what Jennifer thought in those moments, of how she processed the reality of what had been done. But the plan required continuation. The next step had to be taken. Eventually, the call was made. Her voice, when it reached the emergency operator, carried the elements it needed to fear, urgency, confusion. She described intruders, violence, uncertainty. She positioned herself as a victim, someone who had endured something horrific and needed help. And on the surface, it worked. The narrative was coherent enough to prompt immediate response. But beneath the words, beneath the tone, there were subtle inconsistencies, details that didn't quite align with the reality of a genuine crisis. Not enough to be obvious in the moment, but enough to linger. As the call ended and the sirens began to approach, the house held the aftermath of what had just taken place. 2 lives forever altered, one ended, the other hanging by a thread. And at the center of it all, the person who had orchestrated the sequence of events now waited to be seen as something else entirely. The transition from participant to survivor was almost complete. But what had happened in that house was not something that could be contained indefinitely. Violence leaves traces. Not just physical evidence, but patterns, inconsistencies, fragments of truth that resist being fully hidden. And as the first responders arrived, stepping into a scene that seemed, at first glance, to fit a familiar narrative, those traces were already beginning to assert themselves. Because no matter how carefully something is planned, reality has a way of revealing what doesn't belong. The sounds, the movements, the sequence of events, they form a story. And when that story doesn't align with the one being told, it creates a tension that investigators are trained to recognize. That night, the story being presented was one of intrusion and survival. But the reality, still fresh in the walls and floors of that house, told something very different. It spoke of intention, of preparation, of a line crossed not in a moment of impulse, but through a series of choices that led, inevitably, to this point. And as the night gave way to the early hours of morning, as the scene began to shift from chaos to investigation, one thing became increasingly clear. This was not just a tragedy. It was the result of something far more deliberate. Something that had been building quietly, hidden beneath layers of normalcy, until it could no longer remain contained. By the time the first officers stepped through the front door, the house had already begun its transformation from a place of living into a place of evidence. The shift was subtle at first, almost imperceptible, but it carried weight. Every object, every surface, every shadow now held potential meaning. The air itself felt different, heavier, as if it had absorbed what had happened and was reluctant to let it go. The initial priority was clear: secure the scene, locate the victims, assess any immediate threats. But even in those first moments, something lingered beneath the surface, a quiet sense that what they were walking into might not be as straightforward as it seemed. Upstairs, they found Jennifer. She was bound, positioned in a way that aligned with her story. Her breathing was uneven, her voice strained as she tried to explain what had happened. At a glance, it fit the pattern of a survivor, someone who had endured a traumatic event and was still processing the shock. But experienced investigators know that first impressions are only the beginning. They observe not just what is presented, but how it is presented, the timing of responses, the coherence of the narrative, the small, often unconscious details that reveal more than words ever could. As paramedics moved in to assess her condition, officers began to clear the rest of the house. It didn't take long for them to reach the basement. And when they did, the atmosphere shifted in a way that was impossible to ignore. The scene below was stark, final. Bitch Ha Pan lay lifeless, the violence that ended her life evident in the stillness of her body. Nearby, her husband was found critically injured, his survival uncertain but undeniable. The contrast between the two was jarring, one life extinguished, the other clinging to existence in the same space. It was a moment that demanded immediate action, and for a time, the focus narrowed to the urgent task of saving the man who had somehow endured. But even as he was rushed out of the house, even as the chaos of emergency response filled the space, the process of investigation had already begun. Crime scenes speak, not in words, but in patterns. And the patterns in this house were unusual. There were no obvious signs of forced entry. Doors and windows appeared intact, undisturbed. In cases of home invasion, there is often a trail, a point of entry that shows how the intruders gained access. Here, that trail was missing. It was a small detail, easy to overlook in the immediate aftermath, but it was the first thread that didn't quite fit. Upstairs, Jennifer's account began to take shape. She described multiple intruders, their movements through the house, the way she had been restrained. Her story had structure, a sequence that made sense on the surface. But as officers listened, they began to notice inconsistencies. Not glaring contradictions, but subtle shifts, details that changed slightly when repeated, timelines that didn't align perfectly. It wasn't enough to dismiss her account outright, but it was enough to create doubt. And doubt, in an investigation, is often the beginning of something much larger. The physical evidence added to that doubt. The bindings on her wrists were examined closely. In genuine cases of restraint, there are certain characteristics: tightness, placement, signs of struggle. Here, those indicators were ambiguous. The bindings were present, but they didn't carry the same weight of authenticity. It was as if they had been applied with a different purpose in mind. Not to control, but to suggest control. To create the appearance of something rather than the reality of it. As the scene was processed, technicians moved methodically through each room, documenting, collecting, analyzing. Photographs captured the positions of objects, the layout of the space, the details that might later become crucial. Nothing was too small to be considered. A misplaced item, a door left ajar, the absence of disturbance where there should have been some. Each detail was a piece of a larger puzzle, one that was beginning to take shape, though the full picture was still unclear. The basement, in particular, held answers but also questions. The nature of the violence suggested intent. This was not a situation that had escalated unexpectedly. The precision, the control, the way events had unfolded, it pointed to planning. And that realization began to shift the direction of the investigation. Because if this wasn't a random act, if it wasn't a spontaneous intrusion, then what was it? And who, exactly, was responsible? Jennifer remained at the center of it all. She was, at that point, the only person who could provide a direct account of what had happened. Her role as a survivor placed her in a position of both vulnerability and importance. But as the hours passed, as the initial shock began to give way to more structured questioning, the gaps in her story became more apparent. Investigators revisited her account, asking for clarification, for detail, for consistency. And with each retelling, small variations emerged. The number of intruders, their descriptions, the sequence of events. Individually, these discrepancies might have been dismissed as the result of trauma, but together they formed a pattern that was difficult to ignore. Outside the house, the neighborhood began to stir. News of the incident spread quickly, carried by the quiet urgency that accompanies events of this nature. Neighbors, once accustomed to the predictability of their surroundings, now found themselves grappling with the reality that something violent had occurred in their midst. The sense of safety that had defined the area was suddenly in question. But for investigators, the focus remained inside. The house was no longer just a home. It was a narrative, written in physical form, waiting to be interpreted. And as they continued to examine that narrative, the initial assumption of a home invasion began to lose its strength. There were too many elements that didn't align. Too many details that suggested something more controlled, more deliberate. The absence of forced entry, the nature of the bindings, the inconsistencies in the sole survivor's account. Each one pointed in the same direction, though it was a direction that required careful consideration. Because if the story being told wasn't accurate, then the truth was something else entirely. And uncovering that truth would require more than just observation. It would require patience, persistence, and a willingness to question the obvious. As the scene was secured and the evidence cataloged, the investigation moved into its next phase. Interviews would continue. Backgrounds would be examined. Connections would be explored. The focus would expand beyond the walls of the house, into the lives of those who lived there, the relationships that defined them, the pressures that may have shaped their actions. But even in those early hours, one thing was becoming increasingly clear. The events of that night were not isolated. They were part of a larger story, one that extended beyond the immediate violence and into the complexities of a life that had been carefully constructed and was now beginning to unravel. And at the center of that unraveling was a question that would guide everything that followed. If this wasn't a random act, then who had the most to gain from making it look like one? The investigation did not explode into clarity overnight. It moved the way these cases often do, slowly at first, circling the obvious, testing the surface before daring to go deeper. In the early days, the working theory still leaned toward a home invasion. It was the narrative that had been presented, the one that fit just well enough to hold, at least temporarily. But investigators are trained to distrust narratives that come too easily, especially when the details beneath them begin to shift under scrutiny. And in this case, the shifts were already happening. Jennifer remained at the center of the inquiry, but she was not treated as a suspect, not yet. She was the surviving daughter, the one who had called for help, the one who had supposedly endured the same violence that had taken her mother's life and nearly ended her father's. That position gave her a certain protection, a presumption that her account was rooted in truth. But as interviews continued, that presumption began to erode, not through any single revelation, but through accumulation. Investigators returned to her story again and again, each time approaching it from a slightly different angle. They asked her to walk through the night in detail, to recall the sequence of events, the timing, the sensations. At first, her responses followed the same structure she had given before. But repetition has a way of exposing inconsistencies. Small changes began to appear. A detail about how the intruders entered would shift slightly. The number of individuals involved would become less certain. The order of events would blur, then reconfigure. None of it was dramatic. None of it was enough to definitively disprove her account. But together, it created a pattern, a subtle but persistent misalignment between what was being said and what the evidence suggested. While interviews continued, another line of inquiry was developing in parallel. Investigators began to look beyond the immediate scene, into Jennifer's life, her relationships, her history. This is standard procedure in any case of this nature. Understanding the people involved often reveals motives that the physical evidence alone cannot explain. At first glance, her background appeared unremarkable. A young woman from a structured, disciplined household, with no prior history of violence or criminal behavior. But as they dug deeper, the image began to change. The first cracks appeared in her academic history. Records did not align with the story she and her family had believed for years. There were discrepancies, gaps where there should have been continuity, claims that could not be verified. It became clear that she had not been attending university in the way she had presented. In fact, large portions of her daily routine had been fabricated. This discovery did not directly connect her to the crime, but it raised an important question. If she had been living a lie for that long, maintaining it with such consistency, what else might she be capable of concealing? The investigation widened. Attention turned to her social circle, her communications, the people she interacted with regularly. This is where the case began to take a more defined shape. Phone records were obtained, and with them came a timeline that did not align with the story of a random home invasion. There were calls, numerous calls, made in the days leading up to the incident. Calls that connected her to individuals who did not fit into the narrative she had presented. At first, these connections were just names, numbers on a report. But as investigators followed those leads, the picture became clearer. There was a relationship, one that had been hidden from her parents. A boyfriend, someone she had maintained contact with despite the restrictions placed on her. This alone was not unusual, but the frequency and timing of their communication raised questions. More importantly, it provided a potential link to others, people outside the immediate family, people who might have had a role in what happened. As the data was analyzed, patterns emerged. Calls before the incident, calls after, gaps where there should have been none, and activity where there should have been silence. It suggested coordination, not randomness. Planning, not spontaneity. And with that realization, the investigation began to shift more decisively. Jennifer was no longer just a witness. She was becoming a person of interest, but suspicion alone is not enough. Investigators needed evidence, something concrete that could bridge the gap between possibility and proof. And so they continued methodically building the case piece by piece. They re-examined the scene with this new perspective in mind. The absence of forced entry took on greater significance. The nature of the bindings, once seen as ambiguous, now appeared more deliberate. The inconsistencies in her statements were no longer just potential signs of trauma. They were indicators of deception. Still, there were challenges. The individuals connected through her phone records did not immediately present themselves as obvious perpetrators. Some leads led to dead ends. Others opened new questions without providing answers. This is the nature of investigation. It is rarely a straight path. It is a process of elimination, of testing hypotheses and discarding those that do not hold. There were moments when the case seemed to stall, when the available evidence did not yet form a complete picture. But even in those moments, the direction remained clear. The truth, whatever it was, lay not in an external threat, but within the network of relationships surrounding Jennifer. As pressure increased, so did the intensity of the interviews. Investigators began to confront her more directly with the inconsistencies they had uncovered. They presented timelines, questioned specific details, pushed for clarity where her story had previously been vague. This is a delicate process. Too much pressure too soon can cause a suspect to shut down. Too little, and the truth remains out of reach. The goal is to create a space where the contradictions become impossible to ignore, where maintaining the original story requires more effort than abandoning it. And slowly, that shift began to occur. Her responses became less certain. The confidence that had once underpinned her narrative started to waver. There were pauses, hesitations, moments where the structure of her story seemed to falter. It was not a full admission, not yet, but it was movement. At the same time, investigators continued to pursue the external leads. The individuals connected through her communications were identified, located, questioned. Some denied involvement. Others provided partial information. Each interaction added another layer to the case, another piece of the puzzle. And gradually those pieces began to align. The idea of a staged home invasion was no longer just a theory. It was becoming the most plausible explanation. But plausibility is not enough. To bring a case to court, to secure a conviction, investigators needed to establish not just what happened, but how and why. They needed to demonstrate intent, coordination, and direct involvement. And that required a breakthrough, a moment where the evidence coalesced into something undeniable. As the days turned into weeks, the investigation reached a critical point. The lines between witness and suspect had blurred beyond recognition. Jennifer's role was no longer peripheral. It was central. And the question was no longer whether she knew more than she was saying. It was how much she was willing to reveal, and under what circumstances. Because in cases like this, the truth does not always emerge all at once. It comes in fragments, in admissions that start small and grow larger as the weight of evidence becomes too heavy to ignore. And somewhere within that process, within the mounting pressure and the narrowing space for denial, the story that had been so carefully constructed begins to collapse. Not with a single dramatic moment, but with a series of shifts, each one bringing the investigation closer to the reality that had been hidden beneath the surface from the very beginning. The breakthrough did not arrive as a single dramatic revelation, not at first. It came the way truth often does in complex cases, quietly, almost reluctantly, as if it had been waiting for the right combination of pressure and persistence to finally surface. By this point, investigators were no longer asking whether the story of a home invasion was false. They were working under the assumption that it was. The question had shifted. Now, it was about proving it, about turning suspicion into something solid, something that could withstand scrutiny in a courtroom. And the key to that transformation lay in the details Jennifer had tried so carefully to control. The phone records had already opened the door. They had shown connections, patterns of communication that didn't align with her narrative. But data alone is abstract. It suggests possibilities, not conclusions. To move forward, investigators needed to connect those possibilities to real people, real actions, real intent. They began to map out the network, who she had been in contact with, how often and when. The timeline that emerged was precise in a way that felt deliberate. Calls clustered around critical moments. Messages exchanged at times that coincided with key events. It wasn't random. It was structured. And structure implies planning. One name, in particular, stood out. The boyfriend. The relationship that had been hidden. The one that had existed in defiance of her parents' rules. He became a focal point, not because there was immediate proof of his involvement, but because he represented a bridge between Jennifer and the outside world, a link to people who might have had both the means and the willingness to carry out what had been set in motion. When investigators brought him in for questioning, the atmosphere shifted. Interviews with peripheral figures often feel exploratory, a process of gathering information. This was different. There was tension in the room, a sense that the answers being sought were closer now, just beneath the surface. He denied involvement at first, as many do. His responses were measured, cautious, designed to reveal as little as possible. But like Jennifer's earlier statements, they were not immune to pressure. Investigators presented the phone records. They outlined the timeline. They asked specific questions about specific moments, forcing him to account for details that could no longer be ignored. The strategy was deliberate. Not confrontational in the traditional sense, but persistent, narrowing the space for ambiguity. And slowly, the resistance began to crack. It didn't happen all at once. There was no immediate confession, no sudden collapse of the narrative. Instead, there were small shifts, a detail acknowledged here, a connection admitted there. Each one minor on its own, but together, they began to form a pattern that aligned with what investigators had already suspected. The relationship between him and Jennifer was not just personal. It had become operational. Conversations had taken place, discussions that moved beyond the boundaries of a typical relationship and into something far more calculated. Plans had been made, ideas explored, and eventually those ideas had solidified into action. As more individuals connected to the network were identified and brought in, the picture sharpened. These were not random intruders. They were people who had been recruited, coordinated, directed. The notion of a staged home invasion was no longer theoretical. It was supported by emerging testimony, by overlapping accounts that, despite attempts to minimize involvement, pointed in the same direction. Jennifer had not been a passive participant. She had been central to the planning. The moment of convergence, the point where all these threads came together, was less about a single piece of evidence and more about alignment. Phone records, witness statements, inconsistencies in her own account, the physical evidence at the scene, all of it began to tell the same story. And once that alignment is achieved, the case shifts. It moves from possibility to probability, from suspicion to near certainty. But even then, there is one final step. The confrontation. Investigators brought Jennifer back in, this time with a different approach.
The tone changed.
The questions became more direct, less exploratory. They no longer needed to ask what happened. They needed to understand why. They laid out the evidence, piece by piece, not in a way designed to overwhelm, but in a way that made it impossible to ignore the reality of the situation. They referenced the phone calls, the connections, the statements from others involved. They pointed out the inconsistencies in her story, not as accusations, but as facts that required explanation. This is a critical moment in any interrogation. It is where the narrative the suspect has built begins to collapse under the weight of contradiction. Maintaining the original story becomes increasingly difficult, requiring more effort, more invention, more risk. And at some point, the balance shifts. The cost of continuing the lie becomes greater than the cost of abandoning it. For Jennifer, that moment came gradually. Her responses changed. The certainty that had once defined her account gave way to hesitation. There were pauses, longer than before, answers that lacked the clarity they once had. And then, the first admission. It was small, almost tentative. Not a full confession, not an acknowledgement of the entire plan, but enough to alter the trajectory of the conversation. Once that line is crossed, it becomes easier to move further. The structure of denial has been breached. From there, the details began to emerge. Not all at once, not in a single, coherent narrative, but in fragments. She acknowledged communication with those involved. She admitted to a level of coordination. The idea that had once been unthinkable, that she had orchestrated the events of that night, was no longer something investigators had to prove entirely on their own. It was being confirmed, piece by piece, by the person at the center of it all. The motivation, when it surfaced, was as complex as the case itself. It wasn't driven by a single emotion or a moment of impulse. It was the result of years of pressure, of expectations that had become impossible to meet, of a life built on deception that had reached a breaking point. The plan, in her mind, had been a solution, a way to escape a situation that felt inescapable. But the reality of that solution, the consequences it carried, were now undeniable. By the time the interrogation concluded, the case had transformed completely. What began as a suspected home invasion had been revealed as something far more deliberate. A planned act, carried out through coordination and intent, with Jennifer at its center. The breakthrough was not just about identifying the perpetrators. It was about understanding the structure of the crime, the relationships that enabled it, and the decisions that led to its execution. And in that understanding, the investigation reached its turning point. There was no longer any ambiguity about the direction of the case. The focus shifted from discovery to preparation, from uncovering the truth to presenting it in a way that could be tested, challenged, and ultimately judged. Because the next stage would not take place in interrogation rooms or behind closed doors. It would unfold in a courtroom where every detail, every piece of evidence, every admission would be examined under a different kind of scrutiny. And there, the story that had taken so long to unravel would finally be told in full. By the time the case reached the courtroom, the quiet suburban home where everything had happened felt distant, almost unreal, like a place suspended outside of time. But inside the courtroom, there was no distance. Everything was immediate, contained within walls where every word carried weight, every pause held meaning, and every glance could be interpreted as something more. This was where the story, once fragmented across interviews and evidence logs, would be reconstructed in full view. Not as speculation, not as theory, but as a narrative tested against the strict structure of law. Jennifer Pan sat at the center of it, no longer the frightened voice on the phone, no longer the uncertain figure in a police interview room. Here she was the accused. And the transformation from victim to defendant was complete. The courtroom itself was a study in contrast. On one side, the prosecution, methodical and precise, carrying with them the accumulated weight of the investigation. On the other, the defense, tasked with challenging that weight, with introducing doubt, with reminding the court that certainty must be earned, not assumed. Between them sat the jury, a group of individuals drawn into a story they had not lived but were now responsible for judging. And at the front, the judge, overseeing a process designed to separate fact from interpretation. The proceedings began with the careful construction of the case. The prosecution did not rush. They built their narrative piece by piece, starting with the events of that night, then moving outward into the broader context. They presented the scene as it had been found, the absence of forced entry, the nature of the violence, the inconsistencies that had first raised suspicion. Each detail was introduced not as an isolated point, but as part of a pattern that, when viewed as a whole, suggested something far more deliberate than a random act of violence. Witnesses were called, one after another, each adding a layer to the story. Investigators described the process, the way the case had evolved, the moments where the initial assumptions began to break down. Forensic experts spoke about the physical evidence, the details that could not be explained by the narrative of a home invasion. Communication analysts outlined the phone records, the connections, the timing of calls that aligned too closely with the events to be dismissed as coincidence. And then there was the testimony that carried a different kind of weight. The father, the man who had survived. His presence in the courtroom altered the atmosphere in a way that was difficult to articulate. He was not just a witness. He was living evidence of what had happened, a direct link to the violence that had taken his wife's life and nearly ended his own. When he spoke, it was not with the detachment of analysis or the precision of technical detail. It was with the gravity of someone who had experienced something that defies easy explanation. He recounted the night as he remembered it, the confusion, the fear, the moments that remained clear despite the trauma. And then he identified his daughter as part of it. There are moments in a trial that transcend the legal framework, moments where the human element becomes impossible to ignore. This was one of them. The act of a father testifying against his child is not something that fits neatly into legal categories. It exists in a space where emotion and obligation collide, where the pursuit of truth carries a cost that cannot be measured in verdicts or sentences. The defense approached the case from a different angle. Their role was not to prove innocence in the absolute sense, but to introduce reasonable doubt. They questioned the interpretation of evidence, the assumptions made during the investigation, the possibility that Jennifer's statements had been influenced by pressure or misunderstanding. They highlighted the complexities of her background, the environment she had grown up in, the psychological factors that might have shaped her actions. They did not deny that she had been involved in some capacity, but they challenged the extent and nature of that involvement. They sought to reframe the narrative, to present her not as the architect of the crime, but as someone caught within a situation that had escalated beyond her control. It was a strategy that relied on nuance, on the idea that the truth might not be as clear-cut as the prosecution suggested. But the strength of the prosecution's case lay in its coherence. The evidence did not exist in isolation. It connected, reinforced, aligned. The phone records supported the testimony. The inconsistencies in her statements matched the physical evidence. The accounts from those involved, though varied in detail, pointed in the same direction. It was not a single piece of proof that defined the case, but the way all the pieces fit together. As the trial progressed, the narrative became increasingly difficult to dispute. The idea of a staged home invasion was no longer speculative. It was supported by a structure of evidence that held under examination. And at the center of that structure was Jennifer, not as a peripheral figure, but as the one who had set the events in motion. When the time came for closing arguments, both sides returned to the core of their positions. The prosecution emphasized intent, planning, and the deliberate nature of the crime. They reminded the jury of the sequence of events, the coordination required, the decisions made at each stage. They framed the case as one of calculated action, not impulsive behavior. The defense, in turn, focused on uncertainty, on the possibility that the full truth had not been captured, that the narrative presented might be more complex than it appeared. They asked the jury to consider the weight of their decision, the permanence of a verdict, the responsibility that came with it. And then, the case was placed in the hands of the jury. Deliberation is a process that unfolds behind closed doors, but its impact is felt in the silence that follows. Time stretches. The courtroom, once filled with voices and argument, becomes still. And when the jury returns, that stillness takes on a different quality. It becomes anticipation. The verdict, when it came, was delivered with the clarity that the process demands.
Guilty.
Not just in part, not with qualification, but in full recognition of the role she had played. First-degree murder. Attempted murder. Charges that reflected the gravity of what had been done, the intent behind it, the consequences that followed. Jennifer Pan was sentenced to life in prison, with no possibility of parole for 25 years. It was a sentence that aligned with the severity of the crime, but like all sentences in cases like this, it carried a complexity that extended beyond the legal framework. Because while the verdict provided resolution in a legal sense, it did not erase the questions that lingered. It did not restore what had been lost. It did not simplify the emotional weight carried by those involved. As the courtroom emptied, as the formal process came to an end, what remained was a story that had been fully revealed, but not fully understood. A story of family, pressure, deception, and ultimately, violence. A story that had moved from the quiet of a suburban home to the scrutiny of a courtroom, and in doing so, had exposed the fragile boundaries between expectation and reality, between control and collapse. And for those who had witnessed it, who had followed its progression from beginning to end, the conclusion was not just about justice. It was about confronting the unsettling truth that sometimes the most devastating acts are not committed by strangers, but by those who once stood closest. After the verdict, after the courtroom emptied and the formal language of justice faded into silence, what remained was not closure in the way people often imagine it. There was no clean ending, no moment where everything settled into something that felt resolved. Instead, there was a quiet, lingering weight, a sense that while the legal process had reached its conclusion, the emotional reality of what had happened would continue far beyond it. Cases like this do not end when the sentence is delivered. They echo. They leave behind questions that don't have simple answers and consequences that extend into lives that were never part of the courtroom itself. The house where it all happened would never be just a house again. Even emptied, even changed, it would carry the imprint of that night in a way that cannot be removed. Spaces remember. Not in a literal sense, but in the way people perceive them, in the stories attached to them, in the knowledge of what once unfolded within their walls. For the community, that quiet street would no longer feel the same. The illusion of safety, once taken for granted, had been fractured. And while life would continue, as it always does, there would always be a subtle awareness beneath the surface, a recognition that even the most ordinary places can hold extraordinary darkness. For the father who survived, the aftermath was something far more personal, far more complex. Survival, in cases like this, is not a simple victory. It is a continuation, one that carries with it the burden of memory. He had lost his wife, the partner who had shared his life, his struggles, his hopes. And he had lost his daughter in a different way, not through death, but through the revelation of what she had done. To exist in that space, between grief and betrayal, is something few people can truly understand. It is not a pain that fades quickly. It is something that reshapes the way a person sees the world, the way they understand trust, family, and the meaning of connection itself. Jennifer's story, in the years that followed, became something that people tried to analyze, to explain, to fit into frameworks that might make it easier to comprehend. There were discussions about pressure, about cultural expectations, about the psychological impact of living under constant scrutiny. There were attempts to identify the moment where things went wrong, the point at which the path could have diverged into something different. But the truth is, there is rarely a single moment. It is a series of moments, a gradual accumulation of decisions and circumstances that, over time, create a situation that feels inescapable to the person experiencing it. That does not excuse what happened. It does not lessen the responsibility, but it does complicate the narrative in a way that resists simplification. Because this was not a story of pure malice in the traditional sense. It was not driven by hatred alone, or by a desire for violence. It was something quieter, more insidious. A life built on expectations that became too heavy to carry. Lies that began as a way to cope, but grew into something unmanageable. A fear of failure that transformed into a fear of exposure. And in that fear, a decision, a series of decisions, that led to something irreversible. It forces a difficult question, one that lingers long after the details of the case have faded. How do we recognize when pressure becomes something dangerous? How do we create environments where failure is not seen as the end, but as part of the process? These are not questions with easy answers. They exist in the space between intention and impact, between what people believe they are doing to help and what that help actually becomes. For families, for communities, for anyone listening to this story, there is a lesson there, but it is not a simple one. It is not about assigning blame to a single factor or identifying a clear cause. It is about awareness, about understanding that beneath appearances, beneath the image of success or stability, there can be struggles that are not immediately visible, and that those struggles, if left unaddressed, can grow into something far more serious. At the same time, it is important to hold onto another truth, that no amount of pressure, no level of expectation, can justify the choice that was made. Many people experience similar circumstances. Many feel overwhelmed, constrained, afraid of disappointing those around them.
But they do not cross that line.
They do not turn to violence as a solution. And that distinction matters. It is what separates explanation from justification, context from excuse. The story of Jennifer Pan sits at that intersection. It invites empathy in understanding the conditions that shaped her life, but it demands accountability for the actions she ultimately chose. And perhaps that is why it remains so unsettling, because it does not fit neatly into categories of good and evil, victim and perpetrator. It exists in a space where those lines blur, where a daughter can be both shaped by her environment and responsible for destroying it. In the years since, the case has been revisited, discussed, analyzed from different angles. It has become a reference point in conversations about family dynamics, about the pressures faced by children of immigrants, about the psychological impact of living a life that feels scripted by others. But beyond all of that, at its core, it remains a human story. One that began with a family trying to build a better life. One that unraveled through secrecy and fear. And one that ended in a way that no one at the beginning could have imagined. In the end, what stays with you is not just the crime itself, but the quiet moments that preceded it. The routines, the expectations, the small decisions that seemed insignificant at the time. Because those are the moments where the story truly lives. Not in the violence, but in the build-up to it. Not in the headlines, but in the unseen pressures that shaped everything that followed. And maybe that is the most important thing to remember, that behind every case like this, there are layers of context, of emotion, of human complexity that cannot be reduced to a single explanation. And understanding those layers does not change what happened, but it does change how we see it. It reminds us that the line between normal and unthinkable is not always as clear as we would like to believe, and that sometimes the most important stories are the ones that force us to look beyond the surface, to question what we assume, and to recognize that even in the most ordinary places, there can be truths waiting to be uncovered, truths that, once revealed, cannot be forgotten. Time has a way of softening edges, but it does not erase what lies beneath them. In the years that followed, the case faded from daily headlines, replaced by newer stories, newer tragedies, newer questions that demanded attention. But for those who had lived inside its orbit, time did not move the same way. It stretched, folded, and lingered in places where memory refused to loosen its grip. The events of that night did not remain confined to a date on a calendar. They became something carried, quietly, persistently, through every day that came after. For many who encountered the story later, it arrived as a finished narrative. A beginning, a middle, an end. A sequence of facts arranged into something that could be understood, discussed, even analyzed. But what often gets lost in that process is the sense of incompletion that still exists within it. Because while the legal system delivered its answer, life does not operate with the same finality. There are no verdicts for grief, no sentences that resolve betrayal, no structured process that neatly organizes the emotional aftermath into something manageable. The story continues, not in courtrooms or investigations, but in the quieter spaces where reflection takes place. In the way people remember, in the way they reinterpret what happened again and again, searching for something they might have missed. There is a natural instinct to look backward, to examine the past with the clarity that only hindsight provides, to identify the signs, the moments where things could have changed. And in this case, those moments seem to exist everywhere. In the expectations that grew heavier over time, in the lies that began small and expanded into something unsustainable, in the silences where conversations might have altered the course of things, if only they had happened differently. But hindsight, for all its clarity, is also a kind of illusion. It creates the impression that the outcome was inevitable, that the path leading to it was fixed. The reality is far more uncertain. At any point, the story could have shifted. A different choice, a different conversation, a different response. Any of these could have changed the trajectory. And yet, they didn't. What happened instead is what remains. For Jennifer, the passage of time unfolds within a very different context. The world outside continues, evolves, moves forward. But her experience is contained, defined by a space where change is limited, where the consequences of past decisions are not abstract but immediate and constant. In that environment, reflection becomes unavoidable. There is no escaping the reality of what was done, no distance that can be placed between action and consequence. And yet, even there, the complexity of the human mind persists. People adapt. They find ways to exist within circumstances that once seemed unimaginable. They reconstruct meaning, sometimes in ways that are difficult for others to understand. Whether that leads to remorse, to justification, or to something in between is not something that can be easily measured from the outside. For the broader public, the case becomes something else over time. It transforms into a reference point, a story that is told and retold, each time shaped slightly by the perspective of the one telling it. It becomes a cautionary tale, a subject of analysis, a piece of a larger conversation about family, pressure, identity, and the unseen forces that shape human behavior. But there is a risk in that transformation. The more a story is analyzed, the more it can lose its immediacy, its connection to the real lives at its center. It can become abstract, something to be understood rather than felt. And in that shift, something important is lost. Because at its core, this is not just a story about a crime.
It is a story about people.
About a mother whose life was defined by quiet strength and care. about a father who carries the weight of survival in a way that few can comprehend, about a daughter whose path diverged in a way that led to something irreversible, and about a family that, like so many others, began with the simple hope of building something better. There is no single lesson that can be drawn from this, no conclusion that neatly summarizes its meaning. What it offers instead is a series of reflections, each one incomplete on its own, but together forming a broader understanding. It asks us to consider the nature of expectation and how it can both guide and constrain. It invites us to think about communication and what happens when it breaks down. It challenges us to look at the ways in which people cope with pressure and how those coping mechanisms can evolve over time. But perhaps most importantly, it reminds us of something that is easy to overlook, that the most significant changes often happen quietly, that the moments which shape the future are not always dramatic or obvious. They are small, incremental, unfolding over time in ways that are difficult to detect while they are happening. And by the time their impact becomes clear, the opportunity to change course may already be gone. In the end, what remains is not just the memory of what happened, but the awareness it leaves behind. An awareness that beneath the surface of everyday life, there are complexities that are not always visible, that people carry struggles that may not be immediately apparent, and that understanding those struggles, truly understanding them, requires more than observation. It requires attention, empathy, and a willingness to look beyond what is easy to see. The story does not offer comfort. It does not resolve into something simple or reassuring, but it does leave an impression, one that lingers, that prompts reflection, that resists being forgotten. And perhaps that is its final impact, not to provide answers, but to ensure that the questions remain. If you step far enough away from the details, the timelines, the evidence, the courtroom arguments, what remains is something quieter, but no less powerful. It is the echo of a life that once moved in predictable rhythms, now permanently altered. It is the lingering sense that something essential was broken, not just in a single moment of violence, but over years of pressure that went unspoken, unnoticed, or misunderstood. And in that distance, the story begins to shift again, from a case to a reflection, from an event to something that feels uncomfortably close to everyday life. Because what makes this story endure is not just what happened, but how easily parts of it resemble things we recognize. The expectations placed on children, often born from love, but expressed through control. The fear of disappointing those who have sacrificed so much. The quiet decisions to hide small failures, to protect an image rather than confront a truth. None of these are unique on their own. They exist in countless homes, in different forms, across different cultures and circumstances. What makes this case different is not the presence of those elements, but the way they converged, intensified, and ultimately crossed a line that most never approach. It is tempting to view that line as something distant, something that separates ordinary life from something unthinkable. But the reality is more complex. That line is not always clearly defined. It is shaped by context, by individual psychology, by the accumulation of experiences that influence how a person perceives their options. For Jennifer, the world had narrowed over time. The expectations that once served as motivation became constraints. The lies that once provided relief became a trap. And within that narrowing space, the range of perceived choices began to shrink. This is not to say that there were no alternatives. There always are, but perception matters. What a person believes to be possible can be just as influential as what actually is. And when that belief becomes distorted, when the mind begins to frame extreme actions as viable solutions, the consequences can be devastating. There is a moment in stories like this where people often ask what could have been done differently. It is a natural question, one that reflects a desire to understand, to prevent, to make sense of something that feels senseless. But the answer is rarely simple. It is not one conversation that was missed or one decision that was wrong. It is a network of factors, each one contributing in ways that are difficult to isolate. The structure of the household, the communication between its members, the cultural values that shaped expectations, the individual coping mechanisms that developed over time. Each of these played a role, not as a direct cause, but as part of a larger system that influenced how events unfolded. And within that system, there were moments, small, often invisible moments, where a different path might have emerged. A moment where honesty could have replaced deception, where understanding could have replaced control, where vulnerability could have been met with support rather than pressure. These moments are easy to identify in retrospect, but far more difficult to recognize in real time. They are subtle, often overshadowed by the routines and responsibilities of daily life. And yet, they matter. They are the points where trajectories can shift, where outcomes can change in ways that are not immediately apparent. For those who hear this story, who follow its progression from beginning to end, there is an opportunity to reflect not just on the events themselves, but on the underlying dynamics that made them possible. To consider how expectations are communicated, how success is defined, how failure is handled. To think about the balance between guidance and autonomy, between discipline and understanding. These are not abstract ideas. They are lived experiences, shaping the way people interact, the way they respond to challenges, the way they navigate the complexities of their own lives. At the same time, it is important to hold onto a sense of responsibility that does not get diluted by analysis. Understanding context is valuable, but it does not replace accountability. The choices that were made in this case were deliberate. They involved planning, coordination, and a willingness to carry out actions that would have irreversible consequences. That reality cannot be softened by explanation. It stands on its own, demanding recognition. And perhaps that is where the story finds its most difficult balance, between empathy and judgment, between understanding and accountability. It asks us to hold both perspectives at once, to acknowledge the factors that shaped the situation while also recognizing the agency of the individual who acted within it. This is not comfortable. It resists the simplicity of clear categories. But it is necessary if we are to engage with the story in a way that is honest and complete. As time continues to pass, the details of the case may fade for some, replaced by newer stories, newer events that capture attention. But for others, it will remain. Not just as a memory, but as a point of reference, something that informs how they see the world, how they interpret the dynamics within their own lives. And in that sense, the story does not end. It becomes part of a larger conversation, one that extends beyond the boundaries of a single case. A conversation about how we understand each other, how we respond to pressure, how we create environments that either support or constrain the people within them. There is no definitive conclusion to draw, no final statement that resolves everything into clarity. What remains instead is a series of impressions, questions, and reflections that continue to evolve over time. And perhaps that is appropriate, because stories like this are not meant to be closed. They are meant to be revisited, reconsidered, approached from different angles as our understanding deepens. In the end, what we are left with is not just the account of what happened, but the awareness it brings. An awareness that the line between stability and fracture can be thinner than it appears. That beneath the surface of ordinary life, there can be complexities that are not immediately visible. And that paying attention to those complexities, really paying attention, may be one of the few ways to recognize when something is beginning to shift, long before it reaches a point where it can no longer be undone. In the end, what lingers is not the sound of the gunshots or the cold precision of the plan, but the silence that came long before it, the kind of silence that builds slowly, almost invisibly, inside a home where words are measured, where expectations speak louder than emotions, and where fear learns to disguise itself as obedience. It is easy to focus on the night everything broke, to center the story around the violence that made it visible. But the truth is, the story had been unfolding quietly for years, in the spaces between conversations, in the things that were never said out loud. And that is where its deepest meaning resides. Because silence, when it stretches too far, becomes something else. It becomes distance. It becomes isolation. And eventually, it becomes a place where distorted thoughts can take root without being challenged. In that kind of environment, a person can begin to lose their sense of proportion, their ability to weigh consequences against desire, their understanding of what is real and what is constructed. For Jennifer, that silence was not empty. It was filled with pressure, with the constant awareness of expectation, with the quiet dread of being exposed. Every day she maintained the illusion. Every conversation she navigated without revealing the truth added another layer to that internal world. And over time, that world became more real to her than the one outside it. The lies were no longer just tools, they were a structure she lived inside. And when that structure began to collapse, it did not leave behind clarity. It left behind panic, a sense that everything she had built, everything she had used to define herself, was about to disappear. That kind of fear does not always lead to rational decisions. It narrows focus. It distorts priorities. It creates a false urgency where extreme actions begin to feel like the only remaining options. This is not a justification. It is an observation of how the human mind can behave under certain conditions, how it can turn inward and construct a version of reality that no longer aligns with the world as it is. And in that misalignment, the unimaginable can begin to take shape. What makes this story particularly unsettling is not just the outcome, but the contrast between its appearance and its reality. From the outside, everything seemed stable. A family that had achieved what many aspire to. A daughter who appeared to be on a path toward success. A home that fit neatly into the expectations of its environment. There were no obvious signs of danger, no visible fractures that would signal what was coming. And that contrast forces a difficult recognition. That appearances, no matter how convincing, do not always reflect what lies beneath. That people can carry entire internal struggles without those around them fully understanding their depth or impact. And that sometimes the most significant warning signs are not dramatic. They are subtle, easily overlooked, or misinterpreted as something less serious. In the aftermath of cases like this, there is often a search for prevention, for ways to ensure that something similar does not happen again. But prevention is not a simple formula. It does not come from identifying a single cause or implementing a single solution. It requires a broader awareness, a willingness to engage with the complexities of human behavior and the environments that shape it. It involves creating spaces where honesty is possible, where failure is not catastrophic, where pressure is balanced with understanding. These are not easy goals. They require effort, attention, and a willingness to question assumptions that may feel deeply ingrained. But they matter because they address the conditions that allow situations like this to develop in the first place. At the same time, there is a limit to what external factors can explain. The choices that were made remain central to the story. They were not inevitable. They were not the only possible outcome. They were decisions made at specific moments, with consequences that extended far beyond what could have been anticipated in their initial conception. And that is where the weight of responsibility rests. It is not diminished by understanding the context. It exists alongside it, a reminder that even within complex circumstances, individuals retain agency. They make choices. And those choices define the path that follows. For those who reflect on this story, there is an opportunity to hold both of these truths at once. To recognize the influence of environment, pressure, and psychology, while also acknowledging the role of personal responsibility. To understand without excusing, to empathize without losing sight of accountability. It is not a comfortable position. It requires nuance, patience, and a willingness to sit with uncertainty. But it is also where the most meaningful insights can be found. Because the value of stories like this does not lie in their ability to provide clear answers. It lies in their ability to challenge assumptions, to prompt reflection, to encourage a deeper examination of the factors that shape human behavior. They remind us that life is rarely simple, that the lines between cause and effect are often blurred, and that understanding requires more than surface-level observation. As the story comes to a close, there is no final resolution that ties everything together. There is no moment where all the questions are answered, where all the complexities are resolved. What remains instead is a sense of continuity, a recognition that the impact of what happened extends beyond the boundaries of the case itself. It continues in the lives of those affected, in the conversations it inspires, in the awareness it creates. And perhaps that is the most enduring aspect of it. Not the details of the crime, but the way it changes how we see the world around us. The way it encourages us to look more closely, to listen more carefully, to consider the possibility that beneath the surface of even the most ordinary situations, there may be layers we have yet to understand. Because in the end, the story is not just about what happened. It is about what it reveals. And what it reveals is not limited to a single family, a single moment, or a single set of circumstances. It speaks to something broader, something that exists in different forms across different lives. And in recognizing that, we are left not with certainty, but with awareness. An awareness that, if we choose to carry it forward, may shape the way we engage with the world and with each other in ways that are both subtle and profound. There is a point, long after the headlines have faded and the legal language has settled into records and archives, where a story like this begins to live in a different way. It is no longer driven by urgency or discovery. Instead, it becomes something quieter, something that exists in reflection, in the way it lingers in the minds of those who return to it, trying to understand not just what happened, but what it means. And meaning, in cases like this, is never fixed. It shifts depending on where you stand, on what you bring to it, on what you are willing to see. For some, it remains a story of betrayal, of a boundary crossed in the most unimaginable way. The idea that a child could orchestrate the destruction of her own family is something that resists easy comprehension. It challenges deeply held beliefs about trust, about the nature of familial bonds, about the assumptions we make regarding safety within our own homes. It forces a confrontation with the possibility that those assumptions, while comforting, are not absolute. That even in spaces defined by closeness, there can exist distances that are not immediately visible. For others, the story becomes a lens through which to examine pressure, expectation, and identity. It raises questions about what it means to succeed, about how success is defined, and about the cost of maintaining an image that does not align with reality. Jennifer's life, as it unfolded before the crime, was structured around achievement, around meeting standards that were not just encouraged but enforced. And when those standards became unattainable, the response was not to renegotiate them, but to conceal the failure. That choice, repeated over time, created a reality that was increasingly disconnected from truth. And in that disconnection, the stakes grew higher with each passing day. What began as a way to avoid disappointment became a system that could not be sustained. The fear of being exposed did not remain static. It intensified, evolving into something that overshadowed every other consideration. And when that fear reached its peak, it did not lead to confession or confrontation. It led to something far more extreme. This progression is difficult to fully grasp, not because it is illogical, but because it operates within a framework that is deeply personal, shaped by individual perception rather than objective reality. What seems unthinkable from the outside can, within that internal framework, begin to feel like the only viable option. That is part of what makes the story so unsettling. It reveals how perception, when left unchecked, can alter the way a person understands their own circumstances. It shows how the mind can construct a narrative that justifies actions that would otherwise be inconceivable. But it also reinforces a critical distinction. That understanding this process does not mean accepting its outcome. The line that was crossed in this case is one that carries consequences that cannot be undone, regardless of the context that preceded it. In the years since, there have been attempts to categorize this case, to place it within broader discussions about cultural expectations, mental health, and the dynamics of control within families. These discussions are valuable. They provide context, they open dialogue, they encourage a deeper examination of the factors that influence behavior. But they also risk oversimplification if they are used to reduce the story to a single cause or explanation. Because the reality is more complex than that. It is not one factor but many. Not one moment but a series of moments. Not one decision, but a chain of decisions that built upon each other until the outcome became inevitable within the framework that had been created. And even then, inevitability is a matter of perspective. From the outside, there were always alternatives. Paths that did not lead to violence, choices that could have redirected the course of events. But within the internal logic that had developed, those alternatives may not have been visible or may have seemed impossible to pursue. This is where the story intersects with something broader, something that extends beyond the specifics of the case. It touches on the way people cope with pressure, the way they respond to expectations, the strategies they use to navigate situations where they feel trapped. These are not issues confined to one individual or one family. They are part of the human experience, present in different forms across different contexts. And while most do not lead to outcomes as extreme as this, they still shape behavior in ways that are significant. Recognizing that connection does not diminish the uniqueness of the case. It does not blur the line between ordinary struggle and extraordinary action. But it does highlight the importance of paying attention to the underlying dynamics, to the ways in which pressure and perception interact over time. Because it is in that interaction that the potential for both resilience and breakdown exists. For those who continue to revisit this story, whether as investigators, analysts, or simply observers trying to understand, there is a tension that remains unresolved. It is the tension between wanting a clear answer and recognizing that none exists. Between the desire for closure and the reality that some aspects of the story will always remain open to interpretation. This tension is not a flaw. It is part of what makes the story enduring. It resists finality. It invites continued reflection. And in doing so, it remains relevant, not just as a record of what happened, but as a point of reference for how we think about similar situations in the future. In the end, what the story offers is not a conclusion, but a perspective. A way of looking at the intersection of family, expectation, identity, and choice. A reminder that beneath the surface of even the most structured lives, there can be complexities that are not immediately apparent. And that understanding those complexities requires more than a single narrative. It requires a willingness to engage with uncertainty, to consider multiple angles, to accept that some questions may not have definitive answers. That does not make the story any less real. If anything, it makes it more so, because real life rarely conforms to the clarity we seek. It exists in layers, in contradictions, in moments that do not always align neatly with the outcomes they produce. And it is within those layers that the true weight of this story can be found. Not just in what happened, but in what it reveals about the fragile balance between control and freedom, between expectation and reality, between the lives we present to the world and the ones we experience internally. And in recognizing that balance, we are left with something that extends beyond the case itself. An awareness that the most important stories are not always the ones with clear endings, but the ones that continue to challenge us, to ask more of us, long after they are told. In the quiet space that follows a story like this, there is a different kind of reckoning that begins to take shape, one that is not bound by courtrooms or evidence, but by the way the mind returns to certain moments, certain decisions, trying to trace the path backward, as if understanding it more deeply might somehow lessen its weight. It is in this space that the story becomes less about events and more about the human condition itself, about the fragile architecture of identity and the forces that shape it over time. Because what happened here did not emerge from chaos. It emerged from structure, from a life that was organized, disciplined, and outwardly stable. And that is what makes it so difficult to reconcile. We are conditioned to associate disorder with danger, to believe that instability is where risk resides. But this case challenges that assumption. It shows that structure, when it becomes too rigid, can create its own form of instability, one that is less visible but no less real. In that rigidity, there is little room for deviation, little tolerance for failure, little space for the kind of vulnerability that allows a person to admit when something is not going as planned. And without that space, the pressure does not dissipate. It accumulates quietly, steadily, until it reaches a point where it can no longer be contained. For Jennifer, that containment took the form of control over her own narrative. If reality did not align with expectation, then reality could be adjusted, reshaped, replaced with something more acceptable. At first, this might have felt manageable, even necessary, a way to maintain harmony, to avoid conflict, to preserve the image that had been so carefully constructed. But over time, that control became a burden. The more the narrative diverged from the truth, the more effort it required to sustain it. And eventually, the act of maintaining it became a full-time existence, one that left little room for anything else. This is where the story takes on a psychological depth that extends beyond the specifics of the case. It becomes an exploration of how identity can become fragmented, how a person can begin to live in two realities at once, the external one that is presented to the world, and the internal one that is shaped by fear, pressure, and the need to maintain a facade. And when those two realities move too far apart, the tension between them becomes unsustainable. Something has to give. In most cases, that rupture leads to exposure, to confrontation, to a difficult but necessary process of rebuilding. But in this case, the rupture took a different form. It became externalized, projected outward in a way that was both calculated and catastrophic. The plan that was set in motion was not just about removing obstacles. It was about preserving a version of reality that could no longer exist alongside the truth. And that is where the story crosses into something that is both deeply personal and profoundly disturbing, because it suggests a point at which the preservation of identity becomes more important than the value of life itself. That is not a common threshold. It is not one that most people approach, let alone cross. But its existence, even in a single case, forces a reconsideration of how we understand the relationship between identity, perception, and action. It raises questions about how far a person can go to protect the image they have created, and what happens when that image becomes inseparable from their sense of self. For those who reflect on this case from a broader perspective, there is also the question of how systems, family systems, cultural systems, social systems, interact with individual psychology. The expectations placed on Jennifer were not unique in a global sense. Many families operate within frameworks that emphasize achievement, discipline, and adherence to certain standards. These frameworks can produce success, resilience, and a strong sense of purpose. But they can also, under certain conditions, create environments where deviation feels unacceptable, where failure is not just a setback, but a threat to identity. The challenge lies in balance, in the ability to maintain structure without eliminating flexibility, to encourage achievement without making it the sole measure of worth. And that balance is not easy to achieve. It requires constant adjustment, awareness, and communication. It requires an understanding that people are not static, that their needs and capacities change over time, and that systems must adapt accordingly. In the absence of that adaptability, tension builds. And when that tension is not addressed, it can manifest in ways that are difficult to predict. The story of Jennifer Pand does not provide a blueprint for prevention, but it does highlight the importance of recognizing when systems become too rigid, when expectations begin to overshadow well-being, when communication breaks down in ways that leave individuals feeling isolated within their own lives. At the same time, it is essential to return to the core of the story, to the reality of what was done. Because no amount of analysis, no exploration of context or contributing factors can change the outcome. A life was taken. Another was permanently altered. A family was irrevocably broken. These are facts that exist independently of interpretation, that remain constant regardless of how the story is examined. And they serve as a grounding point, a reminder that while understanding is important, it does not replace the need for accountability. In the years that follow, as the story continues to be told, it will likely take on new meanings for different audiences. For some, it will remain a cautionary tale about deception and its consequences. For others, it will be a case study in the psychological impact of pressure and expectation. For others still, it will be a reminder of the unpredictability of human behavior, of the ways in which even the most familiar relationships can contain elements that are not fully understood. Each of these interpretations is valid in its own way, each one highlighting a different aspect of a story that cannot be reduced to a single narrative. And perhaps that is the final point to consider. That stories like this are not meant to be simplified. They are meant to be engaged with, questioned, revisited. They are meant to challenge assumptions, to encourage deeper thinking, to expand the way we understand the complexities of human behavior. Because in doing so, they offer something that extends beyond the specifics of the case. They provide a lens through which we can examine our own lives, our own systems, our own ways of interacting with the people around us. And in that examination, there is the potential for something meaningful, not a resolution, not a definitive answer, but an increased awareness. An awareness that may not change what has already happened, but may influence what happens next, in ways that are subtle, cumulative, and ultimately significant. At a certain point, long after every fact has been examined and every version of the story has been told, what remains is not just memory, but a kind of quiet confrontation with the limits of understanding itself. Because no matter how deeply one analyzes the case, no matter how many perspectives are considered, there is always a part of it that resists being fully explained. It sits just beyond reach, in the space where logic and emotion fail to fully connect, where the question of why lingers without ever settling into a single, satisfying answer. And perhaps that is where the true weight of this story lies, not in what we can explain, but in what we cannot. Because what happened was not only a sequence of decisions, but also a reflection of something more elusive, the complexity of the human mind when it is pushed into a corner of its own making. Jennifer's life, as it unfolded, was not devoid of opportunity, nor was it entirely defined by hardship. It existed somewhere in between, shaped by both privilege and pressure, by both support and control. And within that space, a contradiction developed. On the surface, there was structure, discipline, a clear path forward. Beneath it, there was uncertainty, fear, and a growing disconnect between expectation and reality. That disconnect did not appear all at once. It widened gradually, almost imperceptibly at first, like a crack that expands under pressure until it becomes impossible to ignore. And when it finally demanded to be addressed, it was no longer a small fracture. It was a divide that seemed too wide to cross. In that moment, the options that might have once seemed available, honesty, confrontation, acceptance of failure, no longer felt viable. They had been overshadowed by the fear of consequence, by the belief that exposure would lead to something unbearable. And so, instead of moving toward resolution, the path turned in another direction entirely. A direction that was not just extreme, but irreversible. What is striking is not only that this decision was made, but that it was carried out with a level of coordination that suggests a sustained commitment to the idea behind it. This was not a momentary lapse, not an impulsive act born of sudden emotion. It was something that developed over time, that required planning, communication, and a willingness to follow through despite the gravity of its implications. That persistence is difficult to reconcile with the image of someone overwhelmed by pressure. It introduces another layer of complexity, one that forces us to consider how determination, when aligned with a distorted objective, can lead to outcomes that are both calculated and destructive. And yet, even within that realization, there is no simple conclusion to draw. Because human behavior does not operate within clear boundaries. It is influenced by a multitude of factors, some visible, others hidden, many interacting in ways that are not fully understood. Attempting to isolate a single cause is not only insufficient, it is misleading. It creates the illusion of clarity where none truly exists. Instead, what we are left with is a network of influences, each contributing in its own way, each shaping the context in which decisions were made. For those who seek meaning in the story, there is a temptation to extract a lesson, to distill it into something that can be applied, something that can prevent similar outcomes in the future. But the reality is more complicated than that. The story does not offer a clear warning sign that can be easily recognized, nor does it present a straightforward solution that can be implemented. What it offers instead is a deeper awareness of the subtleties that often go unnoticed, the small shifts in behavior, the unspoken tensions, the gradual buildup of pressure that can exist beneath even the most stable surfaces. It encourages a different kind of attention, one that is less focused on identifying dramatic changes and more attuned to the quiet patterns that develop over time. It suggests that understanding does not come from looking for extremes, but from recognizing the significance of what appears ordinary. Because it is often within the ordinary that the foundations of extraordinary events are laid. At the same time, it is important to acknowledge that awareness alone is not a guarantee. Not every situation that involves pressure or expectation leads to tragedy. Not every individual who struggles with identity or failure turns toward destructive solutions. There is an element of unpredictability in human behavior that cannot be fully accounted for, no matter how much we observe or analyze. And that unpredictability is part of what makes cases like this so unsettling. They challenge the belief that we can always anticipate, always prevent, always understand. They remind us that there are limits to our knowledge, to our ability to foresee the paths that others might take. In the final analysis, what this story leaves behind is not a sense of resolution, but a sense of humility. A recognition that even with all the information available, there are aspects of human behavior that remain beyond full comprehension. That our frameworks for understanding, while useful, are not complete. And that sometimes the most honest response is not to claim certainty, but to acknowledge the complexity that defies it. This does not diminish the importance of seeking answers. It does not suggest that analysis or reflection is futile. On the contrary, it underscores their value, not as a means of arriving at definitive conclusions, but as a way of engaging with the world in a more thoughtful, more nuanced manner. It encourages us to ask questions, to consider multiple perspectives, to remain open to the possibility that our initial interpretations may not capture the full picture. As the story finally settles into its place in memory, what endures is not just the sequence of events, but the impression it leaves behind. A reminder that beneath the surface of even the most structured lives, there can exist complexities that are not immediately visible. That the boundaries we rely on to define safety, trust, and understanding are not always as fixed as we believe. And that within those uncertainties, there is both risk and responsibility. Because while we may not be able to control every outcome, we can choose how we respond to the world around us. We can choose to listen more closely, to question more thoughtfully, to engage more deeply with the people and systems that shape our lives. And in doing so, we may not eliminate the possibility of tragedy, but we can create conditions where understanding has a greater chance to take root. That, perhaps, is the closest this story comes to a conclusion. Not in providing answers, but in shaping the way we think about the questions that remain.